presentations from Colin Galbraith, David Stroud, and Oystein. We will then go to a panel for brief discussion to sort of start to kick off discussion of those issues raised there. That panel are, well, Janet Kahn from SEPA, possibly, I hear. We've got Sarah Robinson from Scottish Wildlife Trusts, Richard Thompson from Forest and Land Scotland, Tom Turnbull from the Association of Deer Management Groups, Jerry Wilson from RSPB, David McLennan from NatureScot. We've got Ian Gillies there as well, and the presenters themselves. So they will have an opportunity to pose some questions in the first instance, as I say, to kick off discussion. We'll have a break around 11:30 for around 20 minutes. And then session 2 will open up for a wider discussion with everyone there, and we'll be aiming to finish no later than 1:20 this afternoon. If you've got any questions during the course of the presentations or even the first session there, you can put them into the chat box there, which you should be able to find on the bottom of your screen if you click on chat there. If you put those in, Brian will be picking those up and collating them through the course of the session, and we'll come back to you for any to expand on those and put those questions to any members of the panel there. Can you make sure that your mics are muted? If you want to raise your hand, that's another function. You can go into participants at the bottom, and you should get the option there to raise your hand. A few other points are the webinar is being recorded today, and it's going to be available for a limited time on our website for a wider group to look at. We're going to be summarising the feedback and discussion today to inform the committee's thinking. And there's lots of ground to cover today. So whilst we might not be able to go into too much detail in the event, we will make sure that we collate any unanswered questions or points as part of this, and we can follow those up after the event. In terms of scope and just making sure that we're staying focused, this is about exploring the issue of conditions on sites and the challenges and opportunities around it. As Ian says, there's 2 other webinars. If we start to stray into those discussions about behaviours or about network approaches, we might have to pull back just to make sure we get the most out of today in terms of talking about conditions. Today's not about discussing the need of protected areas, it's about getting the best out of them, and it's not about the review itself. If people want to have any questions about the review, I'm happy to take those and discuss those sort of offline there. What we do want to do is to be able to capitalise on the wealth of experience and knowledge and insight that everyone around this virtual room has, because that is about shaping our thinking about the principles and our future approach, what the opportunities and barriers might be to take this work forward. So without further ado, I will hand over to Colin.
Ben, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to see you all, actually, and it's a very distinguished group of people we have indeed. What I'd like to do is just go through a short presentation that summarises the think piece, the document that David Stroud and I drafted. So you hopefully will have had the opportunity to see and read that, and then follow that from a presentation from David and then one from Oystein that will take us into examples and some international context for what we're doing here in Scotland. So a couple of just introductory points, really. One, the brief for me is fantastic, actually, in that it was asked to look at the issues here, but to be thought-provoking, provocative, and to try and push the agenda in terms of thinking. So bear with me as we go through this morning to see if I can manage to achieve that. It's got a Scotland focus, but a wider scope as well. I mean, I think it's important to say we are looking at how we can learn from other countries, how we can actually take the best practice into what we do here. It's also terrestrial and marine. It's actually looking at what happens in both environments to see what we can learn from each, to see if we can build on the good practice in each different area. If we can go on to the first slide, please, Brian, or the next slide. Brian should be moving the slides. Hopefully that's it. Brilliant. So the overall structure of the report you'll have seen and this short sort of introductory talk is to look at a number of underpinning issues behind protected areas management monitoring, but then to address the three key questions that were posed by NatureScot staff as a wider structure. Immediately starting this, you can see it's a huge issue in terms of going forward. Ian in his introduction said is the same. So what I've tried to pull out are two or three here of the key issues that underpin protected areas and where we might go in the future. The first one of these is the legal basis, and we have a very clear legal basis founded in UK Scottish law, but with that context previously of EU, now changing, but hopefully with continuity where we can keep continuity going forward. So there is a very clear legal basis. I suppose the first challenge is how we really explored the flexibilities in that. And I think in the paper, I said we seem collectively across Europe to have progressively constrained our thinking into a way of doing. Actually, when you look back at some of the early text of the conventions, the directives, that it may be more flexibility in there that we could explore. And exploring that flexibility is probably timely. With Brexit, rightly or wrongly, it does provide a change, and it potentially introduces an opportunity to do things differently. And there is no doubt the UK, Scotland will need to build its international thinking and its international reputation afresh in light of Brexit going forward. We have to look at that in the context of the twin global emergencies of biodiversity loss and climate change impacts. And a lot of the work I've done at the global level has been looking at how these two intertwined emergencies actually will interact with protected areas, whether that's in Scotland, Europe, or in the developing world. So this is a common issue. And the fourth issue here, in terms of setting management targets and objectives and how we measure success, is actually a very real problem around the world. And whether you're looking at protected areas in Kenya, in Southeast Asia, or in Scotland, actually the issues are very, very similar going forward. So there is a challenge to set management targets. In the past, we've been probably luckier in that the world doesn't have been perceived to have been changing so rapidly. Climate change until the last 20, 30 years was not perceived to be such an issue, rightly or wrongly. So we could set management targets, we could look at measuring success, and it was relatively static. Things are changing much more rapidly now, so we need to be looking in a different way. And the next slide. One of the key issues that's good is that there is this global debate in terms of protected areas and in terms of sustainable development more widely, that really takes us into how we will build targets. We're aware of the 2030 discussions and dialogue, looking at what the 2030 target might mean for protected areas. I think will become a much more high profile debate as we go forward here and globally. We put together this little diagram that makes a few very simple points. And the first simple point is we think from the dialogue and discussions I've had that actually Scotland is pretty close or has already met the 30 by 30 target in the marine environment. That is superb. Looking at the diagram here, you can see that there's still work to do. It takes us into a debate not just about protected areas, but protected areas in that wider landscape in terms of wider countryside. How we will manage that becomes a key part of how we will actually manage our protected areas as well. So maybe the key challenge underpinning this is to manage protected areas in a cost-effective way in a rapidly changing environment while maintaining cohesion and resilience of biodiversity overall. And that cohesion and resilience, I think, are two themes that we may well come back to in the discussion later on. Importantly, in taking that work forward, we need to look at how we measure change and how we got a baseline already from site condition monitoring and from other surveys. Interesting to debate that going forward. It also begs the question about what protected areas are for in this hierarchy, as it were. Are they for particular features, as we've heard earlier, that's the legal route in? Are they for all biodiversity, or are they semi-natural nodes of habitat and species assemblages that may change over time due to climate change? The next slide. I just want to make a simple point here, and yes, it's about marine protected areas. It's about the achievement of getting that portfolio of sites together. But the key point is scale. And if you look at the scale of the protected areas that we have alongside the terrestrial map of Scotland, you realise that this is a massive challenge. So setting objectives on that scale and monitoring on that scale is indeed a huge challenge. I think looking at that challenge, then there are 3 or 4 ways that we could address this. In terms of management, do we maintain the status quo? Are we going to try and maintain the status quo in areas terrestrial and marine? Or secondly, do we allow progressive change? As things change, we let it happen. Do we let natural processes set an agenda on the whole site basis rather than just on the feature basis? Big challenge. One of the issues that comes up legally and from an ecological perspective are the boundaries around any particular site. And in the environment of climate change, rapid change, how do we address the boundaries of any protected areas as well as the management? So do we adopt a boundary flex system where boundaries may move with the interest, or do we apply rigid boundaries as we have in the past? That issue relates also into another webinar, which will look at networks, but actually, do we have a wider network, or do we have a portfolio of sites, or do we have individual sites that legally we must manage in a particular way? So there are challenges of context here that the marine example really brings to the fore. Could you have the next slide? One of the key challenges is actually what to measure. So we have a range of protected sites, we have a range of management objectives. What should we measure? And developing that is a challenge. Do we move towards a risk-based approach, given the scale of what we're dealing with, where we have options in terms of managing whole sites, or just features? Do we manage across a portfolio of sites where we may select some to be focal areas for monitoring, or do we do them all? Or if we have a network of sites, how do we measure that network health, as it were, overall? I think we also have to measure, relate what we measure to the degree of change we're seeing. So if a particular site or feature or interest is changing rapidly, then we may want to monitor it more often than one that is known to be relatively static. Do we want to move as well into ecosystem evaluation and ecosystem processes linked to natural capital as a conceptual way into what we do here in terms of monitoring and in terms of setting management objectives? Can we do that, and can we do that in a cost-effective way? We'll come back to that in the discussion, I'm sure. There is a move, of course, at the global level to move into ecosystem evaluation linked to natural capital that we obviously need to link to. The challenge is how we do that. To the next slide. Moving on then to look again at what we do once we've got a site, once we've got a portfolio, once we've got a network. How do we do that? And when you look at how we've done that in the past, it's tended to be done by professionals, if I can put it that way. And I think there may be, looking forward, a new approach which links 2 or 3 different techniques, which is certainly using professional survey, but also using more of volunteer effort and citizen science, where owners, managers are perhaps more engaged in the monitoring and evaluation of what's happening, linked to new technology. We are, I think, on the cusp of something really exciting here in terms of monitoring around the world, in terms of how we use new technology, and whether that's remote sensing or eDNA. There are a range of techniques that we could usefully begin to deploy, perhaps in a piloted way going forward. We end up, no matter what the survey technique is, with a a mountain of data and information. We have to look at how we report that and look at the wider communication, perhaps in a new way as well, where the wider public can understand better and where the wider public can be more engaged. A final point on underpinning issues from me is we can't avoid the need for knowledge and scientific judgment in this. So we will have a range of data and information. Behind that, the interpretation and the judgment of what that means, for me, is a fundamental point, in that we need to know that we are using the best science, using the best information that we have going forward. The next slide. You have in the diagram, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail here. I hope you have seen it in the report. We've put together a little conceptual framework that looks at the means and then looks at the ends in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Clearly, a couple of quick messages: ecological condition and character of an area, of a site, protected area. It depends on the management. That may hopefully depend on the monitoring and feedback from monitoring to site management, linking through at the top of the diagram to the overall ecological value. And that's where we've been in the past. One of the challenges, of course, is management objectives. So managing not just for biodiversity, but looking to manage for biodiversity plus, whether that's carbon, whether that's other economic interests as well. Go to the next slide. So then we get to the three key questions. And again, in the report, hopefully you've gone through this. Question one is, how can we make better use of the legislation? And I think so that we're safeguarding not only the rare and vulnerable, but actually biodiversity more generally in that changing environment. I think we need to be clearer at defining the purpose, and that's quite a debate to be had about the purpose of protected areas. NatureScot are leading for Scotland. A similar debate is happening across the UK and internationally. From that, how do we select sites? Do we select the most suitable? Do we select a range to be indicators? So there's, again, a debate to be had in there, hopefully using ecological science and potentially social science together to look at how we take forward selection. And then protected areas are part of that wider landscape. So we shouldn't treat them as islands. They are part of that wider landscape, hopefully a sympathetically managed landscape. Looking at cost effectiveness, should we be moving down into a series of indicators? How do we arrange a series of indicators that may actually tell us much more about what's happening on individual sites so that we can build our flexibility? And a theme that I know David and Oyster will pick up is the international action. We need to still have that ability to report internationally so that people can see what we're doing in Scotland and we can learn from others. Go to the next slide. The second question is, are we measuring the right things? Is our current natural feature focus giving us a sense of the overall health and change in our protected areas? I think if I was pushed, I would say probably not. The challenge then is how we develop a methodology to assess the overall health of protected areas in the round. That is a big challenge, and again, it's one that's not been tackled globally to a great extent. How do we make that overall assessment in terms of the politician question is always, well, are protected areas doing better than other areas in the landscape? That is a key question that we need to be able to answer going forward. So do we need to develop new approaches to take forward that debate and that discussion? And then the third question. Next slide, please, Brian. And then the third question is, how do we ensure that any financial investment in management is actually optimal from a biodiversity perspective? And I think there are some key take-home messages here from the paper. I mean, firstly, is to agree the management aims and objectives. Very simple to say, but actually very difficult to do in this changing environment. I think we need to move to focus on resilience, and that is quite a profound change in terms of what that means for management. And I think there has to be a stronger link from the monitoring activity to the management action to change. Do we have a system in place that will actually begin to address that in a way that is cost effective? So we can't avoid the money question. We know that the next 3-5 years are going to be extremely tight in terms of what we do. So moving perhaps to a risk-based assessment of protected area management objectives and monitoring is almost inevitable, I would argue, for today at least. I think that takes us into a new phase of management overall. If we could, Brian, then very briefly, I'm going to skip through 2 or 3 questions that we'll come back to this afternoon, well, this afternoon and later in the general discussion. Final thought is that we are moving into a new way of doing things, I think, unavoidably. Should we rush into that? I think we've got a very strong baseline. We've got quite a unique data set when you look at it from an international perspective. I think the wise thing to do is to, yes, spend some resources, but new approaches to management and monitoring that will look at biodiversity assessment management goals in that framework of climate change and adaptation, and then develop a regional trial of monitoring techniques. So I think having a trial for a period of time is a safety net to ensure that whatever we do in future aligns with where we've been in the past, so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think with that, that's about my 15 minutes. I think, Brian, if I could pause at that and say thank you very much, Brian, for keeping us going through that. I hope that has got some thinking going, get some discussion and questions in due course. As I say, it's all in the report. I'm interested in your thoughts, obviously, on the detail of what we've said. With that, if I could then hand over to David Stroud, who will take us through a short presentation looking at the international context for monitoring and for management. So David, could I hand over to you?
Thank you, Colin, and good morning, everybody. I'll turn my video off if you don't mind, because England's connection to the outside world isn't as robust as in Scotland, and we're on a fairly flaky line here in Northamptonshire. But what I'd like to do just now is to focus on wider context for Scotland's protected area networks, really in 2 respects. The first is understanding change at wide scales and the implications that gives for site level condition assessment. And then the second is providing solutions. Next slide. So we know that Europe's already changing, and it's changing very rapidly, and that has really some direct implications for protected area networks at continental scale. And I'd like to start with just giving two examples of current changes that are going on. They're both water birds because we have particularly good information for migratory birds, extensive data sets, geographically extensive data sets collected over long periods of time. So the first of these relates to smew, which is an Arctic breeding duck, which used to migrate and winter in central and alpine Europe in multiple SPAs created for it. And an analysis of pan-European monitoring data over a 40-year period, next slide, shows that there's been significant recent declines on the traditional wintering areas, and smew are now wintering much further north and west in Scandinavia and around the Baltic. And that redistribution, birds have been moving both into northern SPAs classified already for other species. So if you like, it's a good example of the SPA network catching new incomers, but there's also important concentrations on unprotected sites. So there we have a site network, European site network created for a species, but in need of considerable housekeeping in respect of current change. Next slide. Now, the next example was published in Nature just 6 days ago, and there's a similar sort of analysis relating to scaup, a duck wintering in near inshore waters. We have 4 Scottish SPAs for scaup, the main firths, and the international distribution is concentrated in inshore waters of UK and Ireland, southern North Sea, and the Baltic. Next slide. And here again, we have a similar story, long-term declines in the west of its international range and increases in the east. And as for SMU, that's linked to changing climatic patterns, changing weather conditions in winter. And this, without drilling into the detail of this example, but it raises various policy issues for sites already designated for this species. Next slide. So those are two examples of current changes, but looking to the future, it's clear from the recent EU ecosystem assessment, which suggests that, as with Mediterranean countries, the Scottish Highlands in particular will be especially subject to climatic change impacts, and with all the implications that arise for species and habitat. So there's a significant vulnerability there for interest within protected sites. And again, looking at the future, next slide. Some 8 years ago, DEFRA funded an assessment of the implications of climate change on the SBA network, looking forward to 2050, 2080. And this work modeled the current abundance and distribution of SBA qualifiers onto the SBA network, and then used a Hadley climate change model to run the situation forward, first to 2050 and then to 2080, to see what happened, what will be in the network in 30 years' time, in 60 years' time. Next slide. And the implications are pretty startling. So looking at the two columns on the left, or the column on the furthest left, is the situation for breeding seabirds in 2050. And for some sites, there's no change in the feature list, the white column at the bottom. But there'll be loss of seabirds from a significant number of SBAs, whilst other SBAs gain new internationally important concentrations. And indeed, there are some new internationally important seabird sites sort of settled, which aren't currently SBA status. And essentially the same, but more, is the situation in 2080. Next slide. And looking at the two columns on the, oh, back one, please. Yeah. Looking at the two columns on the right there, so the situation for non-breeding water birds is even more dynamic. Basically, there's projected to be massive change across the network. We're already seeing some of that in Scotland. For example, not just the Scaup example just given, but also grey lag geese redistribution, changes in distribution patterns for waders and others. And overall, this provides quite a stress test for a system based on static lists of named features. Next slide. So how do we address such dynamism in a policy framework based on static lists? Notwithstanding Brexit, the obligations of the directive still exist in domestic law, and there's also other international, we have obligations under other international frameworks, all of which essentially urge four things. Creation of networks of protected areas, well, we have that. Monitoring of these sites, well, we're sort of doing that, but not completely. Consideration of connectivity between sites, well, there's issues to address there. And then finally, adaptation in the face of climate change impacts. And I'd like to just sort of finish by reflecting on adaptation and what it means. So next slide, please. So the change span, the climate change impacts study on the SBA network stressed the need for adaptation to slow and respond to the change for birds. And we have a number of examples of adaptation processes in other countries. And these are some of the issues that have been raised in making it happen. So I think we can think about reducing the vulnerability of sites, protected areas, through adaptation, really along three broad axes. The first is reducing the vulnerability of conservation management. So that's ensuring that processes, organizations, and policies are all fit for purpose, flexible and adaptable. The second is reducing the vulnerability of conservation targets. So that's the on-the-ground stuff, so the habitat management, to ensure that the condition of sites is as good as it can be. And then the third is the big one, of course, which is mitigation of climate change, actually reducing carbon impacts to the atmosphere, which will provide the long-term solutions. But that's a big issue beyond our scope just now. So next slide. So as Colin's already flagged, we feel there's potential here for a pilot to really develop some thinking around Scottish adaptation processes, and recognizing that adaptation at site level, what you're asking a site manager to do, needs to sit clearly within national, UK and international contexts to do some of these things, to establish the priorities, to identify dependencies, really think through the issues for species and habitats of varying mobility. And I suspect there'll be different options for sites of varying size. Your ability to adapt for tiny, small sites is probably less than for your big landscape area mega sites. And important to test and trial that before national rollout. Next slide. So finally, just some conclusions. So I think the first is that we're obviously seeing major changes in the occurrence of mobile species. I mean, we see that particularly with birds, but even for non-mobile species, changes is occurring, although probably less rapidly. All the assessments, all the published assessments in this area really highlight the critical role of adaptation and habitat management in actively slowing the rate of change and reducing vulnerability. As I said, site management priorities need to sit within wider frameworks, and the implication, we need to sort of work through what the implications of this are in respect to our current approach of protected areas being designated for a static list of named features. How there's a whole bunch of issues there, and I guess we'll be discussing some of that later this morning. And then finally, last slide. What we're seeing in Scotland is a reflection of the bigger context, changes occurring at continental scales. So really, I think the take home from this is that the issues can be addressed in Scotland, can really be informed by understanding those wider international contexts. And Scotland also has a potential role in thinking through these issues, and then feeding that back out internationally as well for other countries to benefit from. And this is not new territory. There's multiple international treaties out there that have already started to address these issues, and we in Scotland should benefit from that thinking. Right, thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed for that. I think that's a really good series of examples of what's actually happening out there on the ground and in the sea. So the change is quite profound, and I think your conclusions are really to the point and will help our discussion. So thank you for that. You mentioned international, and of course we're delighted that Øystein is with us from the government of Norway. And I think if I could just hand over to Øystein now, and then we'll open the discussion after that. So Øystein, over to you.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm so impressed with Colin and David, how they were so on spot with the time. I hope I will be the same with you. So let me start off. It's as Colin's pointed out, this is a potentially very complex issue. There's a lot of facets into it. So I think it's a good way forward, as Colin has tried to, to chop it down to smaller pieces and try to solve those. there is a broad approach from me today on the topic as listed there, and as you can imagine, as a government institute, we need to take into consideration political views and also the broader benefits to society, which is something the politicians want to see. Next, please. I'll just show you this briefly. It's a very many faceted tasks the environmental agency has got to juggle with. So it's a competition simply for funding, as I'm sure it is in NatureScot. Next, please. As a person which works with conventions, I just had to bring this on board. There is a climate crisis, but there is also this biodiversity crisis, and there is indeed a health crisis, as we all have been affected by the COVID. I think it's a window there, because we have, as ecologists, we have been warning for decades. David Attenborough, I'm sure, has done the same. And the question now is this a window of opportunity for us to see a change from the business as usual way of looking at the environment? And I think that we do have politicians willing to listen at the moment. Thank you. Next slide. Was just an illustration which I stole from the EU Green Deal, just showing the connection between zoonosis, which is also a tool for us to bring forward our agenda, which concerns both protected areas, but also the species therein. Next, please. I'm sure that the UK is actually in front on a number of issues when it comes to good practices, and can indeed share with the rest of the world, indeed the EU and countries outside, which is also so important. And we do have the basis, we do have the knowledge through the IPBES and climate panel and so on. And it has, as Colin pointed out, there is like the natural capital. We need to look at it. How does it affect our protected areas, and how can we actually involve the sectors? In Norway, at least, it's one of the most important responses, I should say, to any questions or discussions in the society, that we need to bring the sectors on board. And as was pointed out, we do have different roadmaps, be it from conventions or the EU. As you may know, Norway has an agreement with the EU that we will follow the legislation there, and also the directives and so on. So we are very much bound by this, and of course we do enjoy the push, if I can say it like that, from the EU. Next, please. I just wanted to show you this briefly, because it's, I think also Colin pointed out this, I mean, it's a huge task. We cannot expect to be on top of every protected area and to know exactly what's going on with every species and so on. It's simply too much. That's why I will revert back to this a bit later, why we have this system in Norway, which I will now explain to you. So next, please. At the national level, there is of course a lot of funds spent on monitoring, simply because we need indicators, both of the status of the protected areas, but also the wider environment. And this is produced every 5 years as a report that was actually recently published this year again. So it means that we do have funds, and then the question becomes, how do we distribute these funds on which topics? And then, of course, it also becomes a bit difficult for myself, for instance, to get a very good overview, because there is the programs run by or funded by the Ministry of Environment. We have the program run by the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Fisheries. Probably there are others as well. And I should admit that there is today a huge scope or a problem, if you like, to actually merge this data, because there's a huge number of data out there, and we really need to merge it together much better than we are seeing today, even if we do try to produce indicators. Next, please. So for protected areas, solely the protected areas, it's typically, I would say, very much science-based. Some species have been selected, and indeed it's also a selection of sites, and you can see the figures that we have selected. And it is, of course, also a monitoring of ecological change, but also any other kind of threat to the sites, which then might, of course, initiate action. Next, please. And then we have a second level, which is normally it's the county level, but it could also be at the municipality level. They will be given funds from the agency, and they have to first to produce a management plan for every single site they have in their area, and then of course that plan has to include a monitoring program and what the content of that monitoring program will be. So you can imagine that with an increasing number of sites, they will have to distribute the funds, and then you will see a recurring system where they come back every 5 years or so at the site. Some sites, of course, can be more frequently visited, but others also could be less so. As I think, as Colin pointed out, you have wilderness areas which is meant to stay as wilderness, and so you really don't need management as such, and certainly when you don't suspect any change from alien species or things like that, you wouldn't prioritize activities in those areas. Next, please. So to conclude on the overall picture, we have not seen the necessity to monitor closely all protected areas, but I think there is, as I started out with, there is now a window. We see a need to actually see protected areas in a wider context, as was pointed out earlier, not just in case of changes in the protected areas, but also on the natural capital, the ecosystem services that these sites actually provide to society. I think that's something both the public and of course also the politicians are becoming more and more aware of. So I think that we need to change our monitoring activities, and we certainly need to step up our monitoring activities. Also, I should say, mapping out much more what are the natural capital of these protected areas. And hopefully new identified technologies may help us on the way. Next, please. So I think that if you ask me, we will see a shift in focus in the coming years on how we are conducting the business, how we are spending the funding that we do spend on monitoring. I should maybe mention it because I thought I heard that Ian Gillis, I think he said that you were spending 1.5 million pounds a year on monitoring and protected area. That sounded to me very low, certainly much lower than we are spending in Norway, if that was the case. There is still a huge priority among politicians and the funding agencies for substantial funding. At the same time, as I said, we need now more than ever to actually be able to report on other values, ecosystem services that these sites are providing. Next, please. So as we see, the ecosystem services, they are more than just maintaining the species at the sites. There's a lot of services like carbon mitigation and deposition of carbon gases, and yeah, you know, on the more global scale, on the zoonosis, and also I think it's also something we should bear in mind on the sociological issues and values for the public, because they do have you know, a relationship with the protected areas, and they do want to see them maintained for their activities, to put it that way. Next, please. Colin already mentioned that there is no emerging new activities like the environmental DNA and also remote monitoring. And I should say that we have actually worked quite a lot on this, and we have strategies for both. And we are now developing frameworks and also including already starting testing of these new opportunities. So I think we are very likely to see funding, and there will be you know, a permanent activity with environmental DNA and remote sensing of habitats. Next, please. So I think we all understand that the access to data is key here, key to understanding what's going on and to actually prioritize what to do if we need to do anything. So that's a challenge, as I pointed out already, a challenge we have been working with since 2016 to bring on an overview of all the data access points, all the databases, and so on. And now we are trying to actually implement how a platform, how to convene or to get these databases together from the different ministries and also the different agencies, which I think will bring on an entirely new world for all of us. I think I can call this a low-hanging fruit, something we maybe should have done earlier on, but I'm sure you understand that ministries are a bit, you know, separate, and they are funding their separate activities, and that's been the history up to now. So what we need is a cross-sectoral involvement. Next, please. To actually do that, again, it's very helpful and necessary to look on to access experiences made be it in the UK or in Europe or other parts of the world, and this the FAIR principles and the FAIR initiative is one such platform, if you like, of cooperation, which I'm sure that the UK is also taking part in. Next, please. So next, please. So the message is that we need to make data accessible, At the same time, we have to realize that there will be much more data sets, much bigger data sets will now be generated with these new technologies. And there will be a more automated collection of data, and that follows more data. And there is a demand for higher information symmetry for analysis. Next, please. We also have the issue of machine learning. I think that's not something I work with, but still it's something we need to be aware of. And we also need to look more on modeling of impacts, as we heard from David Stroud. And all of that will have to be reformulated into visualizing patterns, so we can have an impact on the politicians and the public at large. Next, please. So I hope we still agree, despite of Brexit, that international collaboration is valuable, if you follow the EU or not. I think the target 2030 by the EU to bring biodiversity back to recovery, I think it's a good initiative. And certainly there are bits and pieces there we should look more carefully into and tag on to. The idea is, of course, in the new Green Deal, as we can call it, is to offer innovative opportunities for conservation and sustainable management of biodiversity through collaboration. And that could be envisioned through harmonized observatories, as they call it, to both monitor and implement activities of research and innovation. And of course, the EU would be interested in profiling themselves as leaders of a Green Deal. Next, please. The Biodiversa is another platform besides of Go Fair, which has been there for a few years, and I'm sure that there are UK institutions involved or government funding as well. It's a long-standing partnership, and the Green Deal by the EU will use this as a partner and build on their experiences. Next, please. I just again stole this slide from the new deal by the European Green Deal by the EU, just to illustrate that the Europe's natural capital is indeed in that circle, but it's only a part of the issues that the Green Deal will, and the sectors, I should say, will have to deal with. Next, please. Next, please. So it might seem like a question of approach. I think that it's not only protected areas we need to look at. We actually need to look at the wider landscape in looking at it from the environmental side, and that's the way we can hope to maintain viable biodiversity and their services. And I think David quite beautifully illustrated this, how species are shifting. So we can't expect them to behave and to only visit the ducks, to only visit protected areas. They will go here and there. So there is a ongoing change, which I've seen myself in Scandinavia. There's a lot of change going on. So the question comes again, what are we talking about actually? Are we talking about going for 30% or maybe the United Nations General Assembly target of 50% managed or protected areas? I would say that we all recognize that 17% is by far enough to actually maintain the species. It's a wider landscape. And I've given you some examples there, which I think is quite illustrating. when half our threatened species are actually forest dwelling species. We can't expect to be able to protect all of these in need of protection through the protection areas network. So you can do the next slide, please. You may say there is another key question to be posed then. How can we hope to use the areas beyond the protected areas? I'm not sure if I have the answer, but in Norway so far, what we have done is to establish what we call a nature base for records, both of habitats and species and the area around. And then we have made it obligatory for any activities, you know, road building or infrastructure or whatever, houses, any threat to those sites which have been registered. And that nature base is continuously evolving as we get more and more data. So it's obligatory to visit that nature base. And then if there are threatened species in the three upper categories of threat, then they cannot go on without having done an impact assessment, which has to be evaluated by a government agency. So it could be a private planning or it could be a municipal planning, but they both would have to go to the government to ask for a review, and if they have taken enough consideration to maintain those sites with species or habitats which are listed in or recorded in the nature base. I think that's a sort of a red flag, if you like, when it comes to use and planning in the wider landscape, and which is then again a way of trying to conserve habitat species beyond protected areas. Next, please. Okay, I'm doing 2 more slides. I will be wrapping up. Hope I haven't gone too way out of my time. I've been very much involved in the Bern Convention and the Emerald Network. What I can say is that it's still in its infancy, even if we have had it running now with a reporting cycle, the first reporting cycle, which ended last year, and there's now a report out, and we have learned a lot, and we see that we need to encourage parties to do much more, and we need to develop better reporting systems, better indicators. There's a number of ways how we can do this. So the Emerald Network, for those of you who don't know, it's a sister of Natura 2000, and it covers 23 countries, and it goes east, as you see it, through to Russia and the Ural Mountains. We declined a request from Russia to cover all the way to Kamchatka, which would have been quite a nice area. So maybe that's into the future. So together, the Natura 2000 and Emerald Network forms the pan-European network. Next, please. I know that the UK, the government of the UK, JNCC, they have expressed skepticism towards adapting totally, at least, into the Emerald Network, simply because there is a reporting requirement, as you have obligatory to do with the Natura 2000. As I said, we have had a sort of an infancy running up to now, and next year will be quite important because we will map out the issues that all parties have actually in reporting and monitoring, and to see how we can adapt. But I find it very hard to think that any party to the Emerald can avoid complying with reporting requirements. For Norway, we have to report on indexes for 140 species and 40 habitats. That is countrywide, and we need to inform on their status, to put it short. And to do that, we involve whomever we can, be it civil society or national threatened species unit, and also of course the monitoring programs. So we try to put that all together and then try to report. Not perfect yet, but I think we will get there. And as I said, for the UK, I think we have noted the skepticism to build new reporting requirements, but this will have to be discussed as of next year within the Berne Convention context. Thank you very much.
Øystein, thank you very much for a fantastic insight into your work in Norway. And I think there are many areas of common ground, and you are obviously tackling some of the issues that we're about to talk about in detail now. So thank you very much indeed for that. We will come back, I hope, later to the Emerald network as well, because there are some important issues in there, I think, in terms of management and reporting. So thank you very much indeed for that. What I'd like to do now for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes thereabouts, is turn to our panel and to get your reflections really on what you've heard. Hopefully the first three presentations have given you the context along with the think piece document, just in terms of what the key issues are as we perceive it, and then to see how that fits into wider actions, you know, across Europe and in particular in Norway. So maybe one of the key questions just to address to begin with is actually in section 2.3 in the report, if anybody is referring to that, which is, we've tried to summarize a key question, which is how to manage protected areas in a cost-effective and flexible way in a rapidly changing environment, while we can still maintain the overall cohesion and resilience of biodiversity in that area. Lots of big words. Essentially that says, how can we do this cost effectively and still keep protected areas cohesive and maintain the biodiversity in it? So I'm interested from the panel, if I will just come round if I can, to get your thoughts on what you've heard so far and on that question. And not picking anyone in particular, but I mean, Jerry Wilson from RSPB, thoughts in terms of what you've heard and what the key issues are for you.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you to all the presenters. I mean, I really enjoyed all those presentations, and indeed reading the think piece that Colin and David put together to underpin today. It's a very big question, isn't it, Colin, to ask? And I mean, I had two thoughts as I was listening to the talks and reading through the report. One actually refers back to the Chainspan report, which I think David referred to in his presentation. And it is worth just reflecting on the eventual conclusions that report reached back in 2013, because although it did note those dramatic changes in distributions of some of the species that our protected network is currently legally required to protect, it did note at the end of the report that overall, if we took our network, and this was the UK network collectively of protected areas, there was reason to be optimistic about the potential to see that as a resilient network in the long term, provided that we, you know, adopted flexible adaptation to climate change in particular, and in essence recommended that we pay close heed to the principles of John Lawton's Making Space for Nature report as a kind of guiding set of principles to improve that network in the future, which, if people remember, is about you know, improving the management of protected areas for the species and the habitats they currently support and those they might in the future, making that protected area network bigger and making it better ecologically connected through the management of the intervening landscapes. And those are all principles that you picked up in the think piece. So it just reflecting on the fact that some of that thinking is kind of there and can be used by linking it back to the principles of the Making Space for Nature report. And the second thing is that we have, Øystein talked about it, but I think we haven't talked about it much, which is, what is the post-2030 global biodiversity framework going to give us to focus on here? And one of the papers that was linked to in the think piece was a paper from a range of international conservation organisations saying, well, what would 30% protected by 2030 effectively mean, and referencing that in terms of reducing extinction risk, reversing declines of more widespread but declining species, delivering ecosystem services, and delivering ecological restoration. If I remember correctly, those are the kind of 4 main components. So one thing we could do, of course, is look at our existing network in Scotland in the context of, and I know that isn't an agreed 2030 picture yet, but it might look something like that. Look at our existing network in the context of those global goals and ask the question, well, what would we need to do with our current network to deliver that? Setting that in the context of, particularly as Des mentioned in the chat, the 8 best drivers. So which are the big drivers affecting our network, individual sites and collectively? And therefore, what would we need to do to deliver those post-2030 framework outcomes, if that's what they ended up being? So I just kind of feel there's a way to address this, and maybe the post-2030 framework as it evolves is a way to help us with that. So that's my initial thoughts. And I noticed a very important question in the chat from Stuart Brooks, which is we've all got to agree what protected areas are before we start, otherwise we'll have different expectations of what exactly we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for the comments, Jerry, and thanks for the comments in the chat as well. Absolutely, the terminology and getting a common understanding is really, really very important. So yeah, thanks for that, Stuart. I mean, same question. I don't know if Sarah Robinson is with us. Is she from? Yeah, there you are, Sarah. Hi. I mean, same question to you, just in terms of initial thoughts and how we might do this going forward, picking up Jerry's thinking as well. You may still be muted, by the way, Sarah.
Hi, sorry, yeah, I've got a couple of screens as well, so it's a bit confusing about where I'm looking, but I am paying attention. I'd like to echo Jeremy's comments about very much welcome the document we were sent beforehand and the talks today. They've been excellent. I guess I've just been thinking of this in very simple terms. I really welcome the mention of flexibility, because I think we do have islands. Our protected areas are in many cases islands, and the nature, it's naturally a dynamic system, and it's going to rapidly change more because of the pressures of things like climate. So we have to look at this in a much more flexible way. We have to consider how we do that, but I do appreciate how challenging that is, and whether that's, I think some of the comments were coming in about almost a buffer zone, I guess, or a predicted zone around a priority or protected area that allows for some of the changes we're anticipating in the future. I think that might be one way to consider it that's a bit more practical. And I guess I'm all for designations and I'm all for these targets, but I think it comes back to one of Colin's very early questions in his talk. He sort of mentioned that we have to demonstrate that these sites or these protections are working. And so from a very sort of basic scientific point of view, we would probably then look to have some sort of control site to compare that to, which is fine. But the designation itself doesn't mean that the investment is there or the capacity is there to deliver on that designation or protect that site. And I think that's where we've fallen short previously. It's wonderful that we've got designations, but are they working? And being able to truly demonstrate that may sort of open the lid on the fact that we aren't investing, back to Oyston's comment about actually that sounds like quite a small amount of money to be delivering what we're expecting. So I think, yeah, there's sort of very practical. Flexibility is excellent. Would love to see it applied. Not sure how. And yeah, financially, I think we've got quite a challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think that's one of the big challenges. And I know that predicting you're due to climate change, getting that interwoven into a legal system is very complex. And I do some work with the UN, and they have recently in one convention adopted a system where countries can take action ahead of time. You can make the countryside, the landscape, more receptive to particular species. And legally that had previously not been possible, as it were. So without getting into too much detail, getting that flexibility and predictability into it is really, really important. I'm interested, I mean, same question, if I can, thanks Sarah for that, to Richard Thompson from Forest and Land Scotland. I mean, you've heard the presentations, you've heard the theories behind it. how does this translate down into your work, you know, in terms of managing areas on the ground?
Thanks, Colin, and thanks very much for inviting me along to this this workshop. It's been a very, very interesting morning so far. Yeah, it is, for me, it is about the practicalities of implementing or encouraging my colleagues to implement management. I specialize in native woodland management, but I've also got an overview, like an umbrella role for all the habitats and species that fall under the protected areas that we have. Yeah, there's no doubt that protected areas are a vital part of our armory. We use them, I think, very effectively to prioritize what resources we have, which, like everybody else has been referred to several times this morning, is a diminishing resource at the moment. Hopefully that will come back on stream in the next few years as we think more seriously about the green recovery. We think more about the 2030 targets, and we'll see enough resources there to achieve our ambitions. But at the moment, we have a limited amount of resources, and so the protected areas, the monitoring results that we get back on those protected areas, that's an extremely important resource for us to be able to prioritize our expenditure. There are some frustrations with the existing system. From a point of view of us wanting to be dynamic land managers and to work with succession and to achieve some habitat restoration of the scarcer habitats like montane scrub, for example, if we're in a position where we are maybe struggling to do that in an SAC because of the balance of existing protected upland heath, then that causes frustrations, but we generally tend to be able to work with NatureScot to achieve what we're after. But the way the legislation is set up, that's a frustrating, and it would be great to see that flexibility increased, as I think it was Sarah, was it, the last speaker said. The system at the moment is set up sometimes to, it's quite frustrating again from an end user point of view, in terms of the sometimes conflicting results. So the classic one is lichens and bryophytes in the woodland, where the lichens and bryophytes might be in a good condition, might be an optimal condition, but the woodland condition may be declining. And so looking at the overall habitat and how to achieve the right balance for all the important stuff in that habitat, that would be really desirable to see that come out of the new system. We welcome the suggestion to go wider than the existing sites. We certainly see that as a very welcome change, and we, like most other land managers, look at the landscape scale and have long-term plans, and we try to think about habitat connectivity and creating buffers around sensitive areas. But if we were actually working with you and had your scientific input to help us to develop that flexibility at the landscape scale, that enhanced value at the landscape scale, then I think we'd greatly value that. And some of my colleagues are working on ecosystem services, flood prevention, etc. And if we could all work together to produce the right answer, that would be fantastic. And maybe some new habitats as well. I was reading the latest British Wildlife talks about bottomland floodplain forest, and that's largely missing from Scotland, and that's a great opportunity to create some new habitat as well. Yeah, I think that's mostly. I think the most important thing for us though is that the data is up to date. We've got some of the site condition monitoring, for completely understandable reasons, goes back a long way. The results go back a long way. We know things have changed, and sometimes things have changed for the better, but we know, unfortunately, that sometimes things have changed for the worse as well. And so if we've got up-to-date data, I think that's particularly useful for us. And also, I think that there's two different things going on with the monitoring. The monitoring is telling us the condition of the special feature, the special feature, but it's also telling us what threats are there, what management is required. And for us, we need to know what management is required first and foremost. And we're doing our own condition assessments. So but maybe those could be used, we could work with you to provide those condition assessments to help to save you some resources.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. I mean, what's interesting that comes out is, I'm paraphrasing, but good monitoring can save you money on management. You know, if you know what to do, you can focus your effort in that way, and getting up-to-date shared information is really, really significant. And I think that theme came out through Oyston's presentation and David's as well. So Richard, thank you for that for now. That's really helpful and interesting. I'm sure NatureScot will follow up on the particular points you mentioned. Actually, it's very good to look at that collaboration. Let me move on, if I can, just briefly to Tom Turnbull from the Association of Deer Management Groups, if I can. Tom, I mean, again, if you like, same question in terms of we're in this changing environment, we're looking at flexibility in protected areas. How do you see that playing out in terms of land management, in terms of your particular area?
Well, I think firstly, I'd echo quite a lot of what Richard's just said. I think, and Oyston alluded to it as well, you know, access to data is key. And if we've got up-to-date information coming in, then land managers are able to act on that more swiftly. And we mentioned briefly managing land on a wider scale out with the protected areas. You know, we're currently attempting to encourage our members, a lot of who already undertake habitat impact assessment across wider areas. And if site condition monitoring is not up to speed in protected areas, then it's difficult to encourage our members to manage their land, to undertake habitat impact assessments on a 3-yearly basis and to then act on that. Oyston also said that he was keen, well, in Norway, they're keen to use innovative opportunities for conservation. I think at the moment the opportunities for conservation are quite difficult to access as land managers, often quite expensive to apply for as well. I think if we could fast track some of those, that would be useful. I think generally a lot of things are market driven in land management, and I think the market for land itself is changing. I think we're on the cusp of seeing more investment for environmental reasons, whether that be rewilding or carbon offsetting. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity to look at the private sector for carbon offsetting opportunities, that sort of thing, and protection of protected sites as well. I think there's definitely an opportunity there. And I was also keen to perhaps know a little bit more about how this might all fit into regional land use partnerships, which are proposed going forward for Scotland as a land use model. At the Association of Deer Management Groups, we undertake collaborative land management, and we try and include everyone within a red deer range, particularly red deer range. And I think it's important, with things becoming increasingly polarized, that we all try to understand one another's objectives and make the most of being able to sit around a table and learn from one another and listen as well. I think that's it from me. Thanks, Colin. Yeah,
thanks, Tom. I think that last point is a really critical point in terms of we tend to forget that we're 95% in agreement, and we tend to focus on the 2-3-5% there where we might have a slight difference. So I absolutely endorse that. And I think, if you like, there is a theme underpinning today and underpinning the think piece, which is about working together, the public, the private, and getting more engagement in the practical sense through, whether it's monitoring or management. So absolutely. Again, we hopefully will come back to that in the discussion. Let me move then to just conservation practitioner David McLennan, if I can call you that. I mean, on the ground, we're having this discussion at the moment. We're looking at this changing environment. We're looking at how we might adapt to that on the ground in terms of still using the term protected area, but in terms of overall management. How does that actually work on the ground, within NatureScot? So, we talk about flexibility, but is that practical from your perspective?
Thank you, Colin. Hang on, can you see me now?
Can hear you just, I don't know, you might need to speak fairly loudly.
Okay, can people see me?
I can hear you and see you now.
Right,
it's
okay.
always useful to know when you've been watched.
Thank you, Colin, and good to see you. And thanks to everybody for their contributions this morning. It's been very helpful to hear that and to see the paperwork in advance. Flexibility on the ground, Colin. Looking at the sort of challenge that you're posing here with respect to how can we manage these protected areas in a cost-effective, flexible way in a changing environment. Well, we are in a very changing environment, and for other people's benefits, the area of work that I work in is in Argyll and the Outer Hebrides, where we are seeing our coastal sites in particular subject to a significant amount of change and predicted change over the course of the next 30 to 40 years. I see what I've seen as a practitioner, as you described me, Colin, is a change in the way that land managers and local authorities think about our natural resources and the value of our natural resources. There has been a perception in my part of the country that protected areas are a problem. There's a perception that there's too many of them already. We're talking about a 30% by 2030 target. The Outer Hebrides has 30% of its terrestrial area in protected areas already. And that has caused tensions with the community and with the local authority. But seeing the challenges that we're facing with climate change that are looming, there's an increased realization that our land, whether it's protected areas or not, is one of our best assets. So looking ahead as to how we can make use of protected areas in a cost-effective manner to deliver benefits for biodiversity and for people, I think that the political acceptance of the need to manage nature is significantly stronger than I would have described it 5 to 10 years ago. So I think there's an opportunity to capitalize on that and to use the twin challenges of climate change and biodiversity to reinforce the importance of protected areas to people beyond the people who might be in this room. We need to go beyond that, and we need to be engaging with people at all political levels, internationally, nationally, and locally. The local political will to manage flexibly is really important at ground level.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it links into another webinar, which is about that inclusion, involvement, communities and citizen involvement. So the two things could come together really neatly actually going forward. So thank you for that. Just check, I don't think Janet Can has managed to join us as far as I can tell. I was going to ask her one or two questions. My final question just on the panel before we break is really back to Ian Gillis. I mean, we've heard a lot in that first session. I take quite strong support actually for the work of NatureScot in terms of monitoring, in terms of inclusion and openness, picking up what David just said. But Ian, I don't know if you want to reflect on what you've heard so far, or should we move through into to take a break at the moment? I think it's been very encouraging so far in terms of the comments from the panel.
Yes, thanks, Colin. It's actually fantastic for me to sit in as a board member of NatureScot and as a member of the Protected Areas Committee on such really such a high-level discussion on protected areas and encompassing such a wide difference of view on protected areas. I find an affinity with David's comments there. We are in from my perception and what I have witnessed in a very rapidly changing world, particularly with coronavirus, we see greater pressure on the land. We see climate change having visible impact on protected areas, and where I live generally on Tyree is probably one of the most highly designated pieces of land that anywhere in Scotland. So I see areas of the coastline disappearing. I see macro systems shifting rapidly. I see marine species changing territory. So all of this is so relevant to the discussion this morning, and it's just so useful for me to sit in on this, particularly to hear Øystein's view from Norway. And I was particularly struck by his comments on the Emerald Network barometer, which is something I've taken a note of to see actually where we are with that in the UK. So yeah, for me, you can break for a comfort break, but thank you very much.
Ian, thank you very much for that at this stage. That's really helpful. I'm conscious we've had the presentations and a quick round of comments from our distinguished panel. What I think we should do now is break. If we could resume as on schedule at 10 to 12, and I think at that point we'll go through the key questions that are identified in the think piece. But Brian, I think I'll come to you at that point as well, just to check that we're picking up comments from the chat box as going through. And again, thank you very much for the comments in there. So if we could break but stay on this connection, I think is the key point, and we'll resume at 10 to 12. For those that have to leave, again, if you can leave any comments in the chat box as we go through, that would be helpful. So I think with that, if we can break for about 15 minutes, back at 10 to 12, but do stay connected. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a useful break. What I'd like to do is broaden the discussion out really over the next hour and a quarter or thereabouts that we've got for our discussions and conversation. What we thought might help give that some structure is to look back through the think piece and to focus on the key questions that we were given from NatureScot, but also to look at the key questions that are listed towards the back of the think piece. And Brian, I think you've got them on a presentation. Thank you for that. So what I'd suggest we do is go through these key questions. Just before we do that, Brian, could I check with you, are there any burning issues that have come up in the chat that we should add on to here from an AOB point of view? We can sweep up questions, you know, the chat points as we go through the questions, but Brian, do you want to just update us on anything?
Yeah, I would, first of all, Colin, I'd just like to thank everybody for making full use of the chat. There's not only questions coming through, but lots of interesting discussion as well that we can pick up on and use going forward. Just a couple of things. This is a comment from Karen Ramu from Scottish Land and Estates, sort of reflecting that flexibility is fine, but we need to be moving as a nation to the situation where policies aren't conflicting for land managers as well. So in some instances, agriculture policy is perhaps getting in the way of other proactive policies for biodiversity. So that's something that perhaps that we'll touch on through the questions coming forward. There was a question from Jane Glass as well about for Øystein in particular, asking whether there were any reflections from Norway as to how data can be better collected and brought together and shared with stakeholders, the wider public, to try and encourage greater engagement with protected areas. And a couple of things again that I think we'll pick up during the discussion. Des Thompson was asking well, what are we protecting and from what? Those are two key questions that need to be addressed as part of this process. I think that's probably about enough for now, Colin, but I'll keep feeding in other comments as we go through. I think you mute, Colin.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. It's the old mistake. Thanks for the update on the chat. I mean, I think the 3 points, the EU, conflicting policies, and we were in that situation in the EU. I hope we can resolve that going forward. The data issue, let's come back to that. It is covered in one of the questions we're coming to. And Des's point about the overall purpose is absolutely written through the think piece. And again, we'll touch on that in the next hour or so, hopefully, as well. So that's great, but keep the comments coming on the chat. That's really good. What we thought we would do then is just go through the key questions that we've listed towards the end of the document and just take them one at a time as we go through. The first one is, we had all the underpinning issues. Does that range of issues, so legal basis, Brexit, twin emergencies, biodiversity, climate change, challenge in setting management objectives, etc., have we managed to pin everything down there, or have we missed anything in terms of the key risks? So, is there are key risks somewhere that we need to take account of that we haven't covered? So I'm interested in any thoughts on that particular point. Don't hold back. All happy that we've covered.
Colin, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, sorry, David. Thank you.
The one that I looked at and thought was the paper is very much focused on protected areas, which is fine because that's what it's all about. However, what I'm not getting out of here is how protected areas relate to other forms of land use and other priorities from other parties. And it has come out in the comments from a few people, but I think it's really important that we think about how we integrate protected areas and what we're wanting to deliver through protected areas with other policies and other priorities at a local level. And I'm not seeing that coming through clearly in the issues in section 2 in the paper.
Yeah, thanks, David, for that. That's really helpful. And again, it's a theme that's come out in some of these earlier comments as well about looking at it in the context of the wider countryside, the other landscapes. So that's certainly something we should put up the agenda. And there was a point earlier about a wider regional land use frameworks. I'm using the wrong terminology, but I think it's to look at how it fits into that approach as well. Other points on section 2, the underpinning issues. Is there anything we've missed? Okay, that's great. Yes, Ruth, do you want to make a comment?
It sort of follows on from the previous comment, just thinking more widely about how the wider countryside influences the success of the protected areas. And
Yes.
the interaction between whether the wider countryside that's not protected actually has a sort of beneficial effect, or whether the sort of edge effect between the protected areas and the wider countryside has a negative effect, and those sort of interactions.
It's interesting when you look at the World Heritage Convention and World Heritage Sites, they have a requirement for a buffer zone round about the core protected area. And that was, I think you're jumping back 20, 30 years. There's a lot of thinking about core and buffer areas, and maybe in terms of this prediction of climate change, moving interest, that may be something that resurrects in terms of a discussion to be had. The danger, of course, if the surrounding countryside is not managed effectively, you end up with islands of protected areas, which are probably even harder to manage in that context. Okay,
Colin,
Ruth, thank
Jerry?
you very much. Jerry?
Yeah, just very quickly, sorry, I'm struggling with various documents and screens to know, but in terms of key risks, I wasn't sure if monitoring capacity had been specifically identified as a key risk, and perhaps it should be. And I noticed David has commented about the SBIF review and recommendations in the chat, but maybe it's also an opportunity, particularly post-COVID, with people being perhaps a bit more connected to the landscapes around them and the places around them? Is there a bit of an opportunity now to re-engage with the wider volunteer and citizen science community in a way that could really help us? That so perhaps there's risk and opportunity there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And again, in the think piece, we have highlighted the opportunity, if you like, to engage beyond the professional ecologist into citizen science, into more landowner participation. So I think you're right. I think it is a risk and an opportunity, but we can certainly flag it alongside here. So yeah, thanks for that. Okay, should we move on to the second one then? I think people are broadly comfortable with where we are on the underpinning issues. The
Colin,
second one's really a key.
Raised his hand.
Sorry?
Richard's raised his hand.
Ah, okay. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, thanks, Brian, because you can see what I can't see, actually.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just think a risk is potentially that we lose sufficient activity for the professional ecologist. It depends how much the current workload of specialists is to help with site condition monitoring. And I know we're not in a position where you're there to employ, NatureScot's there to employ specialists for their own benefit. But I think that there is a risk if we reduce the involvement in professionals that we might ultimately reduce the number of lichenologists, the number of professional ornithologists. So that's something that I think we need to think about.
Yes, I think from memory we went to a stage on lichenologists in Scotland some years ago when I used to work for what was SNH then. I think we went down to 2 or 3 or 4 professional lichenologists, and that becomes a very risky situation in terms of managing features, managing sites going forward. So there is something in there about the background training and sort of development of that specialist nature. I mean, equally, I suppose, organizations, RSPB, BTO, others, Mammal Society come to mind, where that mix of professional and citizen science is really impressive. So yeah, yes, we need to look at it.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I move on to
Ben Fraser wants to come in as well. Colin, sorry to keep putting you.
No, Brian, please keep doing that, because as I say, I can't actually see you can see what I can't. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Colin, it's Ben Fraser here from Natural England. Just something occurred to me just as you were about to move on. I was just looking at section 2.4 in the think piece, which sets out the challenges in setting management targets and measuring success. There's a series of options presented there which form a continuum. And I just perhaps wanted to emphasise that at least in the way we've designated sites in England, and I'm sure it's the same in Scotland, I don't think those will be mutually exclusive by any means. I think there's quite a proportion of existing sites in England that could fit into sort of categories 2 and 3 on that list at least. So the status quo isn't all in category 1, perhaps I would say. That there are sites where we are already recognising progressive change and trying to manage for natural processes. Not in any way, I wouldn't say that we've done that in a complete fashion by any means, but we are some way on that continuum already, I think.
Again, I think beyond today, learning from your experience in that would be really helpful, actually, as an example of what can be done and how it can be done. That comparison becomes very, very significant. So thank you for that. Okay, let me move on to the second question, which is one of the key ones, I think, is are we currently maximising the use of the legislation? And if not, what enhancements can be made to include the protection of a wider suite of biodiversity interests? So without going over all the presentation, I mean, we have a focus on features. We know there's a wider biodiversity interest in protected areas. What can we do to ensure that we capture it? And in the paper, we also talked about the umbrella effect, where if you protect for features, you capture other biodiversity interests, but that may not be holistic, may not be comprehensive. So any thoughts in terms of how we could maximise the use of current legislation? Stunned thought. Again.
Colin, could I come in here?
Yeah, please.
Thanks. I'm a little nervous about the umbrella effect and the example of the golden eagle and the trophic effects. Golden eagle, well, I'm speaking in amongst people who know many hundreds of times more about this than I do, but golden eagle, it seems to me, can live off red deer and can live in a fairly depauperate environment, and don't necessarily reflect whether, for example, the small white orchid is flourishing. And it just makes me a little nervous that if we go to these umbrella species, that we could be actually looking at fairly simplified systems and missing a lot of the detail.
Yeah, and that detail matters, doesn't it, in terms of the overall ecology of the site.
Can I bring in Jerry for a comment, please?
Please, yeah, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Yes, it was just a very brief one, really. It was a very simple one in the context of the way the question's phrased, but within the context of current legislation, of course, we have various pieces of work with recommendations that we haven't necessarily yet addressed. So I'm thinking, for example, of the UK, the third review of the UK terrestrial SPA network, which has, you know, very clear-cut recommendations that lie within the scope of current legislation. But quite a lot of those recommendations are still to be acted upon, or at least thought about in the context of the kind of issues that we're talking about today. So it's just really to mention that.
Yeah, that's useful, actually, Jerry. I may come to David actually on that point just in a moment or two, but I mean, the argument in the paper is actually current legislation has got more flexibility in there than we're using. And maybe one of the issues is, of course, the money follows the legislative focus that we've got on features. But I mean, is there an argument that says actually we could use what we've got more flexibly as now? David, maybe just while people are pondering on that, could it come to you in terms of David Stroud, that is, in terms of the legislation and the approach that Jerry outlined in terms of there's still work to do? I mean, presumably there is flexibility there that you think could be used.
Yeah, yes, indeed, and completely agree with Jerry. I mean, we have a significant unfinished homework, if you like, from the second review in 2001 and the third review in 2016, which really hasn't sort of commenced implementing those recommendations to any significant degree. And I mean, that was a sort of a full review of the entire UK network. So I mean, if we're talking about you know, ensuring fit for purpose networks, then I mean, we ought to at least do what we know we need to do before moving on to some of these other sort of imponderables for the future. And yeah, in terms of the flexibility point you raised there, you know, I'd agree. I think there is significant flexibility. I think there's quite a lot of unimplemented flexibility, if you like, within, you know, the agri-environment, the potential for agri-environment schemes within the CAP. I mean, it's usual to blame the CAP for anything, but I mean, there was a lot of opportunities there that we weren't taking up even when we were part of the EU.
Yeah. Equally, I don't know if any of our other panel members want to comment on that particular point about legislation. I mean, it seems to be really quite important that we use what we have. I mean, the development of amendments to legislation can take time. So there is, I think, a hard analysis that says we've got what we've got for the time being, let's get on and use it. But I wonder if any of the other panel members want to comment on developing new or flexible approaches. All happy?
Maybe I can say something.
Yeah, please, Øystein. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking as I was listening in, you know, there's so many good thoughts being presented. I see a huge potential in the follow-up of the post-2020 targets, whatever they will be, as well as other targets which has been set by the EU and hopefully also by the UK and Norway, which is about cross-sectoral cooperation, because there is a win-win out there. If you look at hard facts like carbon credits or flood mitigation, of course, then if the agricultural sector is to gain carbon credits, to put it that way, then they need to rethink. Otherwise, they won't reach their targets. So I think that there's really a huge scope for you know, to listen much more to each other and to initiate good win-win cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Øystein. I think that dialogue is really important, and in a changing environment that we're in now, that dialogue has come through from earlier comments as well, is really critical, that we have a forum or a series of fora to develop common thinking, common approaches. It's in everybody's interest. Okay, I think we can move on to the next couple of questions. Questions 3 and
Colin,
4.
Before we move on, we've just got Lisa Camphausen, who's from our marine team in NatureScot, who's wanting to come in.
Great, yeah, Lisa.
Sorry, just found my own mute there. Yeah, I think so. Speaking from a sort of marine perspective more, I think I haven't really ever thought that a lack of legislation is one of the issues that's maybe making achieving our sort of targets and addressing these emergencies difficult. But it's perhaps still a little bit of a way to go to perhaps bring a change in the way people accept evidence for sort of those types of legislations, and in terms of the results of how or whether anything is met. I was quite struck by Øystein, a comment Øystein made in the presentation, where I think you said something along the lines of, well, we can't expect to be on top of everything that happens in all protected areas and know what goes on with all the species, because it's just too much, with like quite a lot of confidence, and like that's an acceptable thing to say. Whereas I feel like in the UK, or perhaps in Scotland anyway, that doesn't seem to get accepted sometimes. And there seems to be a sort of, well, if you can't prove to the 10th decimal point that this policy has had absolutely exactly this effect, we're going to get rid of it because, you know, the management clearly hasn't worked. So I think perhaps it's not the legislation as such, but it's the way we're interpreting it and the way we're being pushed to prove the effects that's more of a problem.
I think that's a very interesting observation, and I mean we live in a very data-rich environment, as it were, but there are still huge gaps in terms of what we know and what we don't know. And I think you're quite right that we need that. I keep going back to judgment behind the data set to look at how we implement policies and legislation overall. So thank you for that. Brian, could I check before we move if there are any other comments that you've got?
Nothing coming through on the text. Folks seem to be very effectively raising their hand if they want to come in, Colin. So that seems to be the way to go.
Okay, that's great. Question 3 and 4, these are scientific killers, as it were, because I know that each of these questions could be a seminar in their own right. But let's have a go at them for a little bit of time at least. So what do we consider to be favourable condition or ecosystem health? We talk a lot in the think piece about ecosystem health, ecosystem processes, but we need to define what that actually is. And from that, getting clarity of purpose on protected areas, it takes us into how we then manage. If I could, David, Stroud, could I maybe come back to you, because I know you have fairly clear views on assessing ecosystem health in particular. So, David?
Yes, thank you, Colin. Yes, I'm from my perspective, I struggle to understand it quite honestly, and I appreciate that it's has some traction in Scotland, but it seems to be, to me at least, it's a sort of a metaphor which really doesn't take us forward. I mean, I find condition and condition assessment and the very significant guidance around that to be useful. I think as soon as you start talking about sort of wider health, I mean, maybe it's just me, but I get very confused. So I think there's perhaps an issue there of better unpacking what it actually does mean, and I'm sure there's probably lots of people done lots of thinking on that which I'm not aware of, but that's my take on it anyway.
Do you think it's a terminology issue, or is it more profound than simply the words we use?
I suspect it may be more profound. So, I mean, saying, well, a polluted, dirty wetland is actually a very healthy environment for the things that like polluted, dirty wetlands. So it's all about, you know, what your objective is. So putting a value judgment on, and I accept that favourable is also a value judgment, is difficult.
And I suppose complicated by climate change, changing everything rapidly as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Interested in comments on the question, but also on David's observation, because that, I'm sure, is reasonably contentious with some.
We've got Peter Wright from Marine Scotland looking to come in, Colin.
Yeah, please, Peter, welcome.
Thanks. Yes, I struggle with favourable condition and ecosystem health. I'm a marine biologist working on MPAs, and trying to put this into the context of, do we have a viable population? Is population growth greater than one? We have, you know, in the case of the MPAs, we have sites where we have tiny fragments of remaining some benthic species, and we might say that those species are still there when we survey them 5 years later, but it doesn't actually tell us whether or not we are dealing with a viable population or not. And I do find some of these terms they seem to be more focused on answering something for policy than actually answering something for favorable status of the marine ecosystem in general.
Okay, thank you for that. Just on the chat bar, I mean, Chris Cheffings, I wondered, could I just come to you just to elaborate? I think you're in agreement with David and the comment we've just heard, but Chris, do you want to say anything? Chris, I'm not sure if you are saying something, but you're still muted as far as I can see.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
no, I had a double mute on. Yeah, so we've had workshops where we have pulled specialists across the UK together to try and discuss what ecosystem health might actually mean if you're then going to set objectives and monitoring of those objectives around it. And I think you just keep coming back to, everybody likes the term because it has that kind of, well, I understand what human health is, so I kind of think I understand what ecosystem health is. It's telling us that our land is healthy, but when you try and tie that down into, so what is our management objective and what would we monitor, it all unravels. And I think, you know, this comes back to the points that we were discussing earlier. You know, the legislation is often set in a way that allows for greater flexibility, but it's when you start saying, okay, we've got this nice flexibility, let's think about it holistically, and you start trying to tie that into a set of objectives and monitoring points, that is when you end up with these very static features. And it's, how do we allow for a more changing perspective, not having static features, but without using terms like ecosystem health that certainly have political traction, but are very, very hard to turn into something that you're going to do on the ground. So I think it's probably easier for us to tie that down into natural processes, but even that has difficulties. But yeah, I think there are better ways of doing it than talking about ecosystem health, unless that's what, you know, works for politicians.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure it works for politicians while it works, as it were.
Jerry was wanting to come in as well. Colin.
Sorry, Brian.
Jerry was wanting to come in as well.
Jerry, let's come to you, and then I'll come back to Ruth Mitchell and Sarah Robinson. I see you're in the chat bar, so I may come and ask if you want to add to what you've got in the chat. So, Jerry?
Thanks, Colin. Yes, I mean, I completely agree with what David and Chris have both said about ecosystem health, so I'll say nothing more there. On favourable condition, I just wanted to note that, of course, favourable condition is measured routinely at the site level, but it's also a kind of, favourable conservation status, and condition is also a concept at a higher level, at a member state level in the EU, and that also creates difficulties. So, for example, I think someone also mentioned things like minimum viable population size. So one can decide that an objective is to reduce the extinction risk of a species, for example, to some threshold low level over a period of time, say 100 years, and you can come up with an estimate of what the population size is that you need to meet that. That's often quite small and a rather miserable sort of conservation target. Or you can set some higher favourable conservation status target. But as soon as you start to do that, I think it becomes something that science alone can't answer the question for you. It is in the end a societal judgment as to what a favourable conservation status for a species looks like. So even that, perhaps at higher levels than the site, is quite challenging, I think.
Yeah, no, exactly. Let me let's go to Sarah if you want to add to your chat comment, and then I'll come to Ruth after that. So Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. I think we do have to sort of, include, as well as the sort of almost fixed monitoring that we've traditionally done in trying to assess whether a specific, a very specific population is doing well, and try and bring it into a more holistic look at an ecosystem. I agree, ecosystem health is probably a political term that's very difficult to sort of then pin down in a scientific sense, but I also agree with Jeremy's point that, I do think this is probably more than just a scientific approach, or the scientific rigor that we can try and approach this with is too constraining, is too impossible to meet the targets of, is never going to provide the answer, and certainly not in a time frame that we can then supply to the policy, the decision makers. We've got to find a much more pragmatic approach here that is going to, involve the precautionary principle, is going to sort of take on board people's professional guess. It's a very difficult thing. We're trying to offer some very specific information about, and I just don't think, I think we have to sort of put hands up. That's not possible. You're not going to get a yes, no answer out of us.
Yeah, I think that professional, that professional judgment behind this is actually really significant. So, if you ask a lawyer to interpret the law, he'll do that. So we should equally trust an ecologist to interpret the ecology and come up with a statement, is my own thought on it. Ruth, can we come to you if you want to add to your comments in the chat?
Yeah, sure. I was agreeing with a lot of what's been said. I think ecosystem health, essentially, we're trying to use that terminology as some sort of overarching term for measuring the functioning of the system. And I think there might be ways that we can measure some parts of the functioning of our ecosystem. But I don't think actually measuring ecosystem health overall is maybe possible. So we need to perhaps break that down into different functions that we'd like to measure. But I acknowledge that that doesn't give us the sort of neat yes, no answer that politicians would like in terms of whether the ecosystem is in good health. But there might be some way of exploring measuring functioning in addition to some of the other measuring that's going on.
You said exactly what I was going to say. I think to pilot or trial that approach where you look at some of the functions would be really interesting. And then I'm quite keen actually that if we do any pilot, that we push the specialists to come up with statements that they feel vaguely uncomfortable about in terms of compressing lots of data into one or two sort of not quite sound bites, but we have to maybe get better at communicating to others about what's happening in the whole ecosystem. So again, I suspect there's a wider discussion on that. Brian,
it did cross.
Sorry, Ruth. Yeah, no, please.
It did cross my mind just as you were talking there, whether we need to break it down into multiple functions that we can measure, and then whether they could be put together into some sort of indice or index of health, much like we have a lot of the other sort of indices that NatureScot have developed. But we can't just leap in and have an automatic ecosystem health measure. It needs to be composed of multiple facets.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there's more thinking required, and there's a clear pilot, I think, in terms of how it might be done. David Stroud, you made a quick comment again, if you want to add to that.
Sorry, yeah, I was just sort of reflecting that sort of Ramsar has is one of its core concepts is ecological character, which brings in some of these things of related to sort of function and processes and benefits and services that we've been talking about. And it might be interesting to sort of revisit that in the context of whether that's more useful than ecosystem health.
Okay, thank you for that. We should certainly learn from the international experience, I suspect, to see what can be done. A question for Brian. Are there any other comments on this particular question that we should address, or does anyone else want to comment on question 3?
I think Eleanor had a comment in terms of the new National Forest Inventory woodland ecological condition. Eleanor, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah. Well, just to highlight that it was it's an attempt to measure ecosystem health by measuring a range of indicators like structural diversity and invasive species and those kinds of indicators at a kind of national scale, which then hopefully provides a baseline which will show if you implement this policy or that policy in 5 years' time when it's measured again, has it made any difference? Is it working? So just an example that might be useful.
Thank you for that. Yep, that's very helpful. I think what we're saying overall here is that ecosystem health is a concept that's got traction in terms of public understanding and politicians' understanding, but it is complicated from a practitioner and scientific perspective. There is something in here about ecosystem processes, about indicators, about features that we need to maybe give some more thought to going forward in terms of how that can be gelled into, you know, a coherent approach overall as we move into ecosystems and ecosystem health. I say that as a previous board member on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment at the global level, and we did have some of this thinking and considerations at that stage, but it is still complicated when you get down onto the ground level. Okay, I'm probably going to move on to the next question. Again, Brian, just a quick check. No other comments? I've got a comment from Alison.
No. I think you're good to move on, Colin.
Could take one, maybe Alison Bell. Alison, do you want to make any comment and just to add to what you've got in the text?
It just the way Ruth worded that there made me think that it does sound a bit like the Water Framework Directive in terms of it's got multiple layers of indicators and that kind of thing. But I'm not suggesting that we go down quite the complexity that the Water Framework Directive is.
Yeah, but there is a key issue in there in what you say, which is one habitat or ecosystem learning into another. You know, what we do in let's say river systems maybe in principle be applicable in other areas. So and of course the Water Framework has taken us forward conceptually quite well in terms of thinking about assessment. So, you know, if we can do it there, why can't we do it in other habitat types? So it's a good point. Okay, I'm going to move us on then to question 4, which is another interesting one. The focus through the paper is very much about change and very much about maintaining resilience across the whole spread of biodiversity on protected areas. Is that right? You know, is that actually correct? And then if it is, how can we achieve that while we're delivering multiple management objectives in an area of sea or an area of upland, area of lowland? So picture is rapid change, climate change and others, multiple land uses, but we actually need to maintain resilience. So, you know, is that focus right? And then how can we do it? It's a very good essay question, I think, that one in its own right. But comments? if I can, I mean, just while people are thinking, I wonder, Sarah Robinson, could it maybe come to you just from your perspective in the SWT, because I know you manage, you know, considerable amounts of land now. How does that square with resilience in terms of what you're doing on site?
Yeah, I found it, well, I think it's been mentioned in the comments by others, it's actually very difficult to manage some of the designated sites within a reserve, because the management required for one is very contradictory for the management of another. And I think that sort of breaks down the resilience of the protected area system almost, because we're sat there sort of questioning, well, what's the priority? And if we're looking, and that's why I, you know, was enthusiastic about this flexibility you suggested, Colin, and this need to sort of, you know, not only because we're expecting species shift because of climate, but I think because we have to accept change, we have to accept that dynamism, and that might result in us having to prioritize one protection over another, or consider the site at its widest and within an ecosystem, or look at this landscape restoration, take that approach, which may contradict some of these designations we've got, and we might have to, you know, we might find ourselves in a really challenged situation, and we are in that place. And I know the Cairngorms National Park has found itself in that situation with various designations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does open up some tricky questions in terms of management approach. I mean, again, just picking one or two panel members, I mean, Richard Thompson from Forest and Land Scotland, resilience is a key part of management, but I'm interested in terms of how you're trying to do that in a practical sense.
Yeah, I think we're trying to look for suitable site types for habitats to move into potentially. There was work done in the Blackwood of Rannoch, for example, looking at the place for pine in the landscape, and we're certainly trying to develop that sort of landscape scale opportunities for habitats to move about. Dealing with limiting factors, I guess, is the principal way forward for us. So all the usual suspects, the deer, the rhododendron, etc., making sure that things are in as favourable a position as they can be. Also, well, as part of the management of not just deer but other large herbivores, ensuring the possibility for frequent regeneration events, so that natural selection can allow new genotypes, more resistant genotypes, more climatically suitable genotypes to evolve. So that's one of our aims, not always easy to achieve. But yeah, just trying to look at opportunities at the landscape scale, but also not get too hung up about things changing. If ash ultimately goes out of an upland mixed ashwood, to think about surrogate species within that ashwood. I know Ruth Mitchell's done a lot of work with Alice Broom on this, and it's the sort of advice they've produced for us, following those sort of principles and thinking about surrogate species for ash and trying to encourage those. So much of it's tied down to herbivore management. It's trying to get that right is a big key for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, just on the herbivore management stuff, I mean, Tom, if I could come to you in terms of obviously deer management issues around there, but I mean, maintaining resilience seems to be a theme coming through here in terms of the overall management. Presumably that fits into the manager's perspective as well, in terms of they would surely want to have resilient protected areas and other habitats. But Tom, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. No, I mean, I think that within the area that we work in within deer management groups, you know, there are always multiple management objectives. So that's not unusual, and it's something that we try to or endeavour to overcome, and trying to find some common ground. I think I was wanting to come in anyway, perhaps with my own practical experience as a land manager, as opposed to the high-level expertise that many of the people in the room have. As a farmer, I'm expected to have a minimum stocking density for sheep on my hill. But at the same time, I'm encouraged to reduce the densities of deer. Now that's two, contrasting things. The sheep, on one hand, I have to have so many per hectare, and then we're required to have so many deer, or under a certain density of deer per square kilometre. So I think really at a higher level, what's needed is a sort of joined up approach. We need to be considering all the facets of land management and how they interact, and that there needs to be some flexibility in the approach. And Karen alluded to it earlier. The agricultural policy often contradicts what people are trying to do on the ground as well. And there are limitations with what you can do when you're trying to go into certain schemes based on your position with farming, with whether you're a member of whether you're part of a special protection area or whatever it might be. And I think my concern, going back to the previous question, I wanted to come in and just say that if you guys are unable to determine what ecosystem health means, how are we going to deliver the message of ecosystem health to the practitioners, whether it be farmers or stalkers on the ground? It seems we can't define it. So how are we going to get it across to the people who are actually implementing that work?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent challenge, actually, and it's one that the conservation scientific community really should take up from today. And I know it's already addressing it, but it's really a key question. I think it's about communication. It's also about the integration of science into that common language. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll note that going forward. It's really helpful. The other point in there, I think, is about scale. It's about the scale of assessment, the scale of planning. Protected areas plus the areas around about it becomes really, really significant going forward. And just on that, come to Ruth Mitchell in a second. Your comments in the chat, I think you're saying, should we be looking at resilience across a whole network of sites? But if you want to add to that, I'm conscious, and helpfully that will take us into the next webinar to look at networks. But Ruth?
It's really just trying to sort of square the circle about how do you maintain that flexibility that we've been talking about and have that dynamism that we think we need to cope with change, but at the same time maintain some level of resilience. And I wonder if we need to have a slightly broader look at resilience and look at maintaining resilience across a sort of suite of sites, because I very much doubt that any one site will be resilient to all the potential different threats that it might face. So if we can manage different sites in different ways to make them resilient to potentially different threats, that might overall increase resilience across the whole network.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, it's a question of scale. It's individual or it's the whole network. So I think there's a very clear message coming through there. A question I had for Øystein, if I may. Øystein, we're focusing on resilience. We're focusing on ecosystem processes, looking at things at the bigger scale. I think that fits with what you're doing in Norway in terms of looking at resilience in pretty similar ways. But Øystein?
I'm not sure what to respond to that, Colin. There are possibly the sites are larger, like our national parks, than the ones you have. So there is more resilience in that sense. Forest or species may move upwards. Of course, there is a limit to it, but I think that's the idea at the moment. Now I would need to think more about your question to be able to give you a good answer back. Sorry for that.
Okay.
Just while Øystein's thinking, Colin, Jerry was wanting to come in as well.
Okay, Jerry.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, it's just, picking up the theme on resilience, and it's very much supporting what others said, I think. I did actually ask colleagues who kind of look after our reserves network for some observations on this. And of course, in RSPB, we keep a very close eye on site condition measured in very similar ways to NatureScot, because many of our sites are designated. And their response was that, yes, of course, we're managing for resilience. You know, you can think of many examples: peatland restoration, you know, increasing the spread of Scots or allowing Scots pine, Caledonian pine forest to spread up the hill at Nethy, and so on and so forth. But they said the biggest challenge to keeping sites and individual features within sites in favourable condition, as we would define it, is when there's a threat to those sites that's caused by kind of wider landscape or wider environmental management. And I think, you know, and so that could be, you know, catchment impacts of water quality on a site like Strathbeg, as an example. So I think the point there to me was that it absolutely shows that achieving resilience at the site level really means we have to adopt this kind of landscape scale ecological network approach. Otherwise, there are going to be a whole load of challenges that we simply have no chance of really addressing because they're contingent on the way we manage the wider landscapes around those sites.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Let me summarize. I think what we're saying is scale really matters here. Yet resilience is critically important. The scale really matters. I think the language around this really matters as well, going back to the earlier point that we had from Tom. There is a need, I think, to take the thinking forward here, especially in light of delivering the multiple management objectives that we know we're going into. It's not just biodiversity, it's biodiversity plus carbon, etc., etc. So there's I think a real intellectual challenge as well as a very practical challenge in terms of how it's delivered on the ground and how we engage and involve people going forward. Brian, can I check if there are any other comments on question 4? That's usually a good way to prompt questions, by the way, when you say you're going to move on. So Brian, anything else coming up on that?
No, not at the moment, Colin.
Okay. I mean, looking at question 3 and 4 together, I mean, the defining or looking at ecosystem health, looking at resilience, it does sound academic, but actually it has very direct implications in terms of management, in terms of what will be there in terms of habitat type, species type, and boundaries in particular. So these are really profound questions for NatureScot and for us all to grapple with going forward. So thanks for your input to them in particular. Let's move on then to questions 5 and 6. Slight change of tone here, if you see it derived through the paper. The paper suggests that there would be a range of monitoring methods that could be trialled. So professional surveys, citizen science, landowner, manager involvement, new technology, potentially done on a risk-based approach across a portfolio or a network. That in combination is quite radical, deliberately to push your thinking and our collective sort of thoughts on the way forward. But then the safety net, I suppose, would be to say is we should trial that alongside what we've got already, because again, the observation from the paper is what we've got in Scotland is a really fantastic data set. I know it's got gaps, I know it's got issues in terms of time series, but when you look at it in comparison to other, even European countries, then we have something really, really important here to make sure we get continuity. So, I mean, my argument is whatever we put in place should at least bolt back into the data sets that we have already established. But the question is, would it be useful to trial a combination of monitoring methods? And if so, how could we do that in practice? So thoughts on that one, please. I mean, again, just to start it off, I mean, just looking at practitioners, David McLennan, I'll maybe come to you. I think you mentioned earlier that you're getting that more flexibility, community engagement, involvement would be really helpful. I mean, can you see a way that getting more involvement in monitoring from communities could happen in practice?
It is happening to a degree in some sites already, Colin.
Mm-hmm.
We work with some of the community land owning organisations who are conducting, I could offer North Harris as an example, mm-hmm. where the community landowning trust are undertaking monitoring, which is feeding into the management of that SAC. So it is happening in small places to a degree. I do hear too, though, from communities that there is an appetite to have more say in how protected areas are managed. We're hearing that clearly from the youists at the moment. That's coming from local councillors. So to me, there is an opportunity to take advantage of situations where local communities are expressing a view themselves to have more input into the ongoing management of sites. Well, let's say, right, okay, what do you want to do then? How do you want to play your part in the monitoring and management of the site here? I've cited the US as an example. We're also looking at, I've referred to the climate change work that we're doing, which is looking at the resilience of macher habitats and coastal habitats in the USTs. So there's a package of different things that are happening that I think we could work with the community on. And that could be a place where this type of monitoring could be tried. But I'm sure there will be other places in Scotland that could also be looking at things in a different way. So yeah, it's happening to a degree already. There is an appetite in other places to do more. So why not try it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the best examples of involvement in monitoring in protected areas and in terms of management objectives, actually, my experience, come from the developing world in Africa, and Kenya, Zambia in particular. There's some fantastic examples of local community involvement. It's not just engagement, it's real involvement in monitoring and in the overall sort of setting objectives. So we can certainly learn from others on it. Comments on what David said? So we should basically try it. Brian, anything on the chat or otherwise we need to pick up?
Well, Jerry's wanting to come in, and then Ruth's got a point in terms of continuity of data and how might we best maintain that if we are moving to perhaps a more fragmented approach to monitoring.
Okay, Jerry, let's go to you and then to Ruth. And
yeah.
I mean, Jerry, on protected areas and use of volunteers, I mean, RSPB does this to a huge extent. I just wonder whether that could be pushed even more. But Jerry?
Yeah, well, I mean, I spoke, yeah, just a couple of very quick comments on the question as stated. Would it be useful to trial the combination of monitoring methods outlined here? I mean, my view would be yes, but always be problem led. You know, in other words, identify, well, you know, if for example we're interested in eDNA techniques, be clear about what question we want to ask and where to apply it, rather than just sort of rolling it out because it's an exciting new method. But I think that's probably mentioned in the paper itself. In terms of, yeah, so RSP, as David's noting in the chat bar, I mean, we do carry out condition assessments for our own purposes on our own sites, and I think and on occasion we have been involved in carrying out site condition monitoring for NatureScot. I mean, and I think we recognise within the RSPB there's probably an enormous unfulfilled potential for our membership to be more involved in monitoring activity on our own sites, which we really don't exploit and develop as much as we should do at the moment. So I think there's potential there for us as a landowning charity with a big membership to have our membership more involved in this activity than is currently the case. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I think it's absolutely crucial in all of this that we don't end up in a situation where a landowning organisation like RSPB effectively ends up marking its own homework. I think you know, that's where a line needs to be drawn, and the statutory agency still has that responsibility to make those judgments based on the data that are collected.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point actually, about if you like an independent review of what,
yes,
in that case RSPB as a land manager are doing. So yeah, important point. Thank you for that. Ruth, could I come to you? I think it was on continuity of data.
Yeah, it was really just to highlight that, well, I'm sure there might be perhaps better ways of monitoring things now or new methods we could trial. We do have a huge resource in terms of the data we've already got, and to try and make sure that we can continue that data set in some way and have some sort of overlap between doing the old way of collecting the data maybe and the new way of collecting the data, so you can make that comparison. And you don't throw out the sort of baby with the bathwater and lose the value of that long-term data set. And also just to think about what other uses are made of that data. So I know recently we've been discussing changes in site condition monitoring, but actually those data are actually used in a lot of different indices that NatureScot use. So it's not just the knock-on consequences for site condition monitoring, but the cascading implications in how else that data is used.
It's a good point. I mean, there are multiple benefits, if you like, from it. So that's the point.
Yeah.
Just commenting on the chat bar from Chris, I agree. The combination of monitoring is not fragmented; it's integrated or coordinated. Absolutely, going forward. Okay. I think what we're saying is it would be useful to trial a combination of monitoring methods, and if so, how it could be done. How do we do that in terrestrial and in marine sites? Because they bring their own challenges, don't they, in terms of different ecosystems. But that is something that we could take forward potentially. I'm interested in any particular comments in relation to marine in that question. All comfortable?
I could comment, Colin, that on the marine side of things, from again, I'm speaking from experience, particularly in the Barra area, where SNH, as it was, had extensive engagement with the local fishing community around the Sound of Barra, which was challenging. One of the things that came out of that work, though, was that if there were opportunities for the local fishing community to be given the opportunity to be involved in monitoring, which would actually stimulate some sort of economic benefit for the community at the same time, then that was something that they would have at that time been interested to discuss. So I do think that there could be opportunities to work with the inshore fisheries sector to help with marine monitoring. Obviously, we need to be crystal clear about what the scope of that monitoring is, and that it's done in a consistent way. But there are resources there that I think can be tapped into to help.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's yeah, something to be picked up on again, actually. Yeah, thanks, David, for that. That's useful. Okay, I think, Brian, if there's nothing else on that, we'll move on to question 6.
There was a question from Jerry, Colin, about approaching research councils in terms of themed packages of funding to start to address these critical questions. And I mean, from just to add to that, from my own perspective, we've got the RESAS strategy out from Scottish Government at the moment, and whether there are opportunities in there we should be tapping into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both are very valid points, and certainly research councils, I think, would be very interested in some of the issues that we're raising here in terms of their impact overall. So that's a useful comment. Let's move on then to question 6, which is what role could monitoring ecosystem processes, we've touched on that to a degree, and natural capital assessment make in informing the management of protected areas? If I was to ask the question generally about the natural capital that's held on our protected areas in any country in Europe, actually, I think we would struggle to come up with a very clear answer. So the question, I suppose, is where does natural capital fit into this? Is it worth considering a natural capital assessment, even as a trial pilot of some protected areas? Again, natural capital is an extremely useful concept. Obviously, there's reports planned from government on it going forward in terms of the finance behind it. So it does have traction with governments across Europe. How do we use it here is the general question. Thoughts? I mean, again, just to kick it off, I mean, David, I'm going to Stroud, I'll come back to you. Natural capital in terms of protected areas, do we have good examples from any global sort of initiative?
Yes, there are indeed a few, and I'd struggle to give you them right away, but there's significant work in a number of countries, so I can certainly come back on that. Okay.
I mean, it's certainly one of the trickle-down effects from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, albeit that was 10 years ago or more now. but it is that expectation of individual countries undertaking natural capital assessments and ecosystem assessments leading through to protected areas. Thoughts and questions? How would we do all that? I mean, we potentially are stacking up work here to do in terms of, you know, we're moving from features to whole biodiversity to ecosystems and focusing on ecosystem processes and natural capital. That's a huge shift in terms of work to actually bring that about, if that were to be realistic. But I'm interested in terms of how that might actually work. Yeah, Sarah Robinson, can I come to you? I see you've got a comment.
Yeah, I was just saying, you know, we've talked a lot about trying to join up policy and trying to join up thinking and cross-sectoral working. And I think that's where natural capital perhaps can help us. Yeah, I mean, there's loads of caveats around that in terms of how would we actually apply it to protected areas, or in terms of measuring them. But I think it could help that language barrier that we find across sectors and ensuring that it's involved in other people's thinking. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lindsay was also commenting on the dam management planning process perhaps being something that we could look at. Lindsay, is there anything you want to say on that?
Thanks, Brian. It was just to make the point that we've currently got, you know, dam management plans at a landscape scale sitting over about 3 million hectares of the upland range. And, you know, from what I can see, I know the natural capital assessment process is still fairly early days, but from what I can understand, you know, the sort of metrics that we're already capturing within these plans are very similar to the sort of metrics that we'd be looking to capture at that landscape scale through the natural capital assessment process. So I'm just wondering, you know, we already have that collaboration at that landscape scale. I'm just wondering, you know, if that's a mechanism that could be used to trial some of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, getting the metrics right is an absolutely critical point alongside natural capital, because others will interpret and some may misinterpret. So I think getting the metrics right, it is just fundamentally important. I'm sure that's, in those that use natural capital, they are addressing that, but it's an absolutely key point. I mean, a question from Jane. I don't know if you want to enlarge on that in the chat as well about the RESAS work.
Hi, thanks, Colin. It was really just more of a comment, I think, at that point, just in terms of that being a potential opportunity to think about what data sets are actually out there. I know there was some work recently done for SNH on kind of public interest around lowland deer management, and I think just trying to figure out who had which data and where the gaps were, and it was quite a challenge, I think, for the researchers who did that. So it could be that there's some really interesting projects there just to consolidate what we have and how to then move forwards in terms of improving the linkages and how best to use that data.
Sure, yeah, it is a real opportunity actually, and it's timely as well right now. So yeah, thanks for that. Okay, I think we've had a reasonable run through there. I mean, we're seized on natural capital as a useful concept. We need to get the metrics on it right. We focused on ecosystem processes earlier. We've had some thoughts on that. So Brian, I mean, depending on comments, I'm going to move us on to what is the last question on this sequence, question 7.
There's just a comment there from Ross Lilly, Colin, about the trial that NatureScot is intending to commission for a natural capital assessment at landscape scale. So I wonder whether Ross wants to come in and give us a wee bit more on that.
Yeah, that would be helpful actually. Sorry, Ross, I missed that in the chat. It's to say I'm multitasking and failing would be an understatement. So Ross.
It's just to outline that with the natural resource management unit in NatureScot, we're actually testing the natural capital approach at various scales, including working out what the metrics would use to value biodiversity within the natural capital approach. Because I think it's still an area that the approach doesn't really properly set out at the scales we want to do. So we're doing it at 3 scales. We're testing it through the payment by results approach at a field level. And we're testing it at holding level by coming up with a natural capital assessment template that farmers, foresters, land managers can use. And at landscape scale, we're hoping just to issue a contract very soon to get some thinking done on how we would use the natural capital approach at landscape scale, using the island of Islay and Wester Ross as examples of both areas, obviously including protected areas within them. And so that would be doing an assessment of those two areas initially, and then testing that with communities and stakeholders as to whether they think the priorities that it raises and the data that's being used are appropriate and where the gaps are, and then using that process to inform how land management can be, land management change can be brought about to deliver the priorities that it comes up with.
That's really interesting example, Ross. I mean, if there's anything public that you could send around this group, actually, I think that would be really helpful whenever you're ready to do that.
I can do that, yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you for that. I hadn't picked that example up, so that's really good to know. Okay, Øystein, I think you had a point as well that you're doing some work in Norway that's relevant here to look at a common platform. Do you want to add to that, Øystein?
Well, I might just to reiterate that we did a study from 2016 to 2020, and now we are implementing, building a common platform, a common repository, if you like, for the different sectors. We are not going to do a trial, of putting data together. We might, of course, but then that depends on if there are any issues, relevant issues. Could be, giving data on how much carbon is stored in mires in Norway, just to take an example. But I think the prime idea was that the public, the journalists, NGOs, they can more easily access the data. I think that's very crucial, actually, for because the government is not going to criticize itself, so we need this push from the outside, and this is accepted by the government. So we have been instructed to build such a repository and a common platform for all the existing relevant, I should say, data sets that's out there. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks for that. Sharing data and making that available more widely is really important, actually, and it's touched on in the paper. So let's see if we get any follow-up from that. Brian, again, I think I'm going to move us on to the last question, unless there are others coming in. No? Okay. The last question is, are there enhancements needed to the current protected area management assessment methodologies, especially in the light of climate change and other impacts? So essentially, are we assessing management correctly? Is there a proper feedback from monitoring to management? We heard earlier that, essentially getting timely and accurate monitoring information can really focus management and potentially save money, I suppose, in the long term. But thoughts on that? So, taking it all together, all the issues that we've heard so far, does monitoring work? Does it inform management? Is there a feedback, and how could we, I suppose, enhance it? Any thoughts? While you're thinking, I mean, again, I'm interested in those who manage land in particular, and coming back maybe, if I can, to Richard Thompson. I mean, I think earlier on you were saying about the value of monitoring, but do you think, looking beyond your own organisation, but generally we've got the feedback right from monitoring to management? Or could it be enhanced?
I think it would be useful to maybe have some sort of credit system where efforts to try to get a site into favourable condition, to get a feature into favourable condition, were recognised more transparently. And maybe it's particularly hard. I'm thinking of a site with common SCOTA on, for example, where ourselves and our neighbours are doing all manner of different things, try to get that site into a favourable situation for common SCOTA. It's really, really hard to try to get things right, and for the birds to successfully breed. And it's not quite in a situation where we're getting no on-site remedy. We are doing lots of on-site stuff, and hopefully the birds will respond favourably. But we and others are putting a huge amount of effort into trying to get that site into a good state. So some sort of credit system for effort, I think, would be quite helpful. And I know that maybe sounds a bit banal, but you need the land managers to come along with you, and if our effort is acknowledged in some way, everybody's effort, not just FLS, then I think that's going to encourage people, rather than saying, you know, something is, a feature is favourable or unfavourable. Just some way of acknowledging that effort is going to be very helpful.
I think that's a really neat idea, actually. That I spent some of last night, and I'm sure some of you did as well, watching the Nature of Scotland Awards online. And I mean, that's all about reward. And I mean, some of the entries are superb examples of people trying their hardest to make things better. And I think getting some sort of credit system is really worth exploring, actually, for land managers, for conservation groups, and for others. So it's a really interesting concept. Thank you for that. David Stroud, I think you had a comment in the chat as well about using existing monitoring in terms of looking at the sensitivity of what we've got already.
Well, I was just making the obvious point about, you know, if you're monitoring for something, you know, how sensitive is the existing monitoring in telling you about what you want to know about, and working back from limits of detection. I mean, it's basic experimental design, isn't it? But I mean, it's pretty fundamental if you're thinking of reshaping monitoring systems, is to be sort of clear as to what you want to detect and whether existing or proposed programs are fit for that purpose. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
I think Jerry
Brian,
was wanting to come in, Colin.
Sorry, Brian, say it again.
Jerry was wanting to come in.
Yeah, sorry, Jerry, carry on. Yeah, please.
Well, just very briefly on that brilliant common SCOTA example that Richard mentioned, I think that I completely agree with the suggestion, and it just made me think about the fact that when we talk about monitoring, there's the kind of routine monitoring that we do in response to what we might call routine management interventions, where we have a well-established conservation intervention that there's evidence for and confidence in. There is also then a situation which I think the Common SCOTA is a very good example of, where there is no magic off-the-shelf package of Common SCOTA management. We are trialling and testing, you know, ways to deliver the conservation outcomes for that species. And so it was just really to make the observation that, as well as a credit system for effort, which I really like the idea of, just bearing in mind that I think in many instances we do need a stronger connection between the science community and the management community to make sure that we are, you know, we are designing what we might call, in the very broadest sense, experimental tests and interventions in a way that we get good data from and that we learn from, and in a kind of adaptive management sense, and that we publish those outcomes, you know. And there are journals now that, you know, explicitly designed to help do that, you know, journals like Conservation Evidence, where even, you know, small scale operational trials you can publish the results of and we can learn from. So it was just to make that point about connection between the scientific and the operational.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's pick that up in a little summary at the end as well, actually. Thank you for that. Brian, could I check, are there any other comments on this one?
Nothing at the moment. We must be getting to low blood sugar level, I think.
Yeah, you can feel it creep on, can't you? You know that lunchtime is approaching, so let's be fairly quick. Let's move on to the next slide, if we can, Brian. So if we go, we've not quite thanked people yet. If we go back, yeah, go back one. Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, we've summarized, we've skated over and got into a huge number of issues. What do we do about it? We're potentially looking at a very difficult situation, climate change and other impacts. So do we move to a new system, looking at all the issues that we've touched on today? I think David and I are really suggesting that, yes, change is going to happen and we need to make it happen. But actually, maybe the sensible and safe thing to do is to look to pilot some of the key approaches to management and monitoring so that we do get continuity. And we're suggesting in the paper, you'll have seen it, I won't go over all the detail, that we do look at biodiversity assessment, how we're assessing what's there in the round, that we are looking at management goals, especially in light of this multi objective sort of world that we're now living in and will increasingly from any part of the sea or land, that we do set that inside a climate change adaptation framework. And that's not just words. I mean, that's to say, here is an opportunity for NatureScot and Scotland in the round to show some leadership in terms of looking at just at the practical level with landowners, managers, what this actually means. And what's at the back of our mind there is, of course, the climate change COP, hopefully, potentially in Glasgow next year, that it'd be very, very nice at some of the events around that to be able to show off positively and proactively what we're doing here in Scotland, possibly linking Oyston to where you are in Norway as well. And then as part of that is to develop a regional trial of monitoring methods, you know, to look at professional judgment, citizen science, new technology in the round to address the issues that are there. So the question really for the last 5 minutes or so is, does that kind of pilot appeal? And, you know, are there any sort of amendments, changes you might make to that sort of pilot? I should say there's absolutely no commitment to this. It's simply David and I sort of flying a kite, as it were. But over to you. So is that an appealing thought or not? I'll take silence as agreement and a commitment to fund it, by the way.
Like, again, I can come in, Colin, because I do think it's an appealing prospect. And looking at the work that we've been doing in the Outer Hebrides, 7 years ago, I dug some papers out. We actually did a piece of joint work with Cornynillan, looking at protected areas and how we could look at a different way of managing things with more community input, with more local authority input. So there was an appetite to do things in a different way then. Building in the climate change work that we're very, very closely aligned with the local authority and other community planning partners on. I think there's a wonderful opportunity here to do something different. So yeah, thumbs up from me. And if you were looking for somewhere to test something, I would be offering the US in particular as a place that could be ideal for this. But I recognize there could be others.
Yeah, thanks, David, for that. I mean, I agree. I think somewhere like the US would be a fantastic area to trial some of this on for a multitude of reasons, but mainly for the work you've done in the past in terms of community involvement, engagement as a starting point. So yeah, thank you for that. Other thoughts?
Could I just say, Colin, Sarah here.
Yeah, hi, Sarah.
Yeah, the management goals bit sort of leaps out to me because with all of our biodiversity assessments, we're aiming for high biodiversity often. But in the paper, we've referenced things like self-willed land or rewilding, or, you know, and some of the climate change adaptation may take us to a point where we're looking at how we manage in a different way. And some of that management or that management approach might actually have negative impacts for biodiversity. So I guess it's finding the balance of those two things, you know, because when I see sort of biodiversity assessment at the get-go, you know, if we're looking for a dynamic system, if we're looking to, you know, adapt, it's just how we sort of make those management goals achievable and affordable. Because coming back to those sites, one of those sites that I mentioned earlier, you know, we've got a species-rich grassland that is some might describe as a sort of cultural construct. So it managing that into the future is quite a challenge if we're looking to adapt to climate and satisfy sort of woodland targets. Yeah.
I think it's a very good example, and I think I would certainly see the trial addressing just these issues, in that we need to work through systematically 2 or 3 examples of that kind of trade-off judgment that we need to put into practice, you know, so taking the science into the practical land management. So I think it's a good example. I think it's exactly what I see the pilot actually beginning to address. I think
Chris was wanting to come in, Colin, if we...
Please, yep, carry on.
Okay, thanks. I was just going to say that JNCC is just at this moment starting to build up some local pilots in England at the moment of how we can use citizen science in a more local area to understand how the environment is changing. So it kind of builds on our national data sets, but kind of looks at how we can deploy them in a local area. So, you know, I think we'd be really keen to see if we can use some of the ideas that we're building into those England pilots into the Scotland situation as well. You know, there's nothing that JNCC does that should ever exclude any country. So I'd be really keen to kind of look at how we can do that.
I think that's important, Chris. I think learning from different countries around the UK is a key part of going forward. So that would be really helpful. I'm sure Brian and Ben will follow up with you on that. Great.
Jerry was wanting to come in now, Colin.
Sorry, Jerry, yes, over to you.
Sorry, yeah, I was hesitating as to whether to respond to your initial question, Colin, because I was struggling a bit to get my head around exactly what this would look like. But I suppose my question would be, does it need breaking down into what comes first and what comes later? So given everything that we've talked about, it sort of feels as though, you know, in the kind of post-2020 CBD world, we need to first to think about what are we trying to achieve with an individual protected area, or indeed the network of protected areas, so that there's some big questions which might require some piloting, which might be more focused on the management goals, either at the site or network level, and then some of the rest of the things on your slide then follow from that. So yeah. I guess the thing that was going around in my head is whether there's a bit of ordering within this rather than piloting all of the things that you've got on that slide all at once.
No, absolutely. I think there is a very clear project plan that would have to be developed behind that would build in your point, build in your timeline point, and your objective setting for that kind of trial pilot is really critical. So no, you're absolutely right, of course.
Thanks.
I'm conscious, Brian, that time is marching on, and
just one last one, if we may, Colin. Lisa was wanting to bring out a marine perspective to this, and then I think we'll call a halt.
Okay, Lisa.
It's a comment question for David McKim, actually. So in the marine environment, we've got this MAPAM, this Marine Protected Area Management European project running, which to some extent is trying to address some of this, doing regional management plans with strong community leadership and involvement. And I was just wondering, David, do you, because you didn't sort of mention that at all, is that something that you don't consider to be addressing these sort of points?
No, it's certainly something that it was making significant progress. It stalled somewhat with COVID, understandably, but yeah, it's helpful and it ties in with this. But nothing's really been done in the terrestrial environment. So yeah, it is of significant benefit, the work that MARPAM is doing with people in the marine environment.
Good. Okay. Brian, if there are no other comments, let me just add a few summary points if I can. I mean, that's been a fantastic run around the whole subject, and hopefully everyone feels they've had the opportunity to make the comments and input to the discussions. I mean, if not, I would suggest you follow up with Brian and Ben from today to get some comments in. Let me just highlight one or two key points from me from all that. It's not a summary, it's just one or two highlights. I think what comes out today is that monitoring is key, and maintaining continuity across data sets is absolutely vital in terms of getting a picture. We are moving into multi-objectives for protected areas. How do we do that? We need to set protected areas in that wider countryside framework. A theme has been flexibility in terms of protected areas, but also flexibility in terms of the overall approach that's used, and the need to pilot that, of course, is there. I think inclusion, if I can use that word, in terms of getting local communities, people, scientists involved and thinking together, co-design, if you like, is really important. Cost unavoidably will come into this, and I think we are probably unavoidably moving to a risk-based approach, whatever that actually means going forward. We heard about the plea to join up the approach between land management and science, and I really echo that in terms of the way forward. You know, from a Scottish perspective, we're a very small country We've got some fantastic protected areas and resource. We need to join up our thinking, probably better than we have in the past. Looking internationally, we can learn from other countries. Norway, Øystein, a great example. But the Emerald Network is worth further consideration as we go forward. That's really all in terms of summary. Final thoughts from me, just a thank you really. And I'll come to Ian Gillis to sum up in a minute and to close the meeting. But thanks from me to Øystein and David today for, I thought, fantastic presentations. But to the panel in particular for your wisdom, really, in terms of taking us through this, and to everyone in terms of participation. I think it's been really excellent. But also to NatureScot staff in general for your input to the think piece. I enjoyed it in terms of the conversations we had, a bit like old times. And then specifically to Brian and Ben, if I can, from NatureScot, who I think have organised this impeccably. So thank you all for that. I think, Ian Gillis, if I now hand back to you.
Yes, Colin, thanks very much. And thanks also to Brian and Ben for making things run so smoothly. I'm amazed actually at how smoothly with all of these participants. And from my perspective, from the board of NatureScot, thank you to all of you for your time and your input today, which is really for me underlines the partnership approach to protected areas and how valuable seminars like this are, or webinars as we now call them. All of the comments have been captured, and there are so many links and comments down the side there, but as it's being recorded, they are all captured, and perhaps we'll have time later to reflect on all of these links and the comments in the sidebar. But for next steps, the Protected Areas Committee, the commission was, how can we best deliver maximum value from Scotland's protected area network in line with NatureScot's statutory responsibilities and within budgetary constraints? And this is just one of 3 webinars that are taking place over the next 3 weeks, Condition of Nature. The others are looking at behavioural science to improve perceptions and engagements, as I said at the start. And the second, to look at the contribution these sites can make to building and strengthening ecological networks. And all of this, everything will be fed back to the Protected Areas Committee of NatureScot and will ultimately be reported to the board by my chairman, Aoife Martin, who chairs the Protected Areas Committee. So it is just so valuable to get this insight from such a knowledgeable group of people. And I just would like to say thank you. I've found it absolutely fascinating and invaluable. So thank you, and also once again to Colin, Ben and Brian for organising this, for writing everything up and for having everything run so smoothly.
Thanks everyone, and I think we're done. I think lunchtime has arrived. Thanks Ian for your kind words as well. But thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank
you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks to you.